A scandalous affair leads to a public divorce, but genetic tests reveal a truth no one expected. Within private laboratories and luxury penthouses, medical proof emerges that challenges notions of betrayal and loyalty. Between accusation and vindication lies a story that proves destiny has its own plans. As results circulate through society, true deception reveals its face. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The penthouse shimmered, a jewel box overlooking the city's glittering expanse. Champagne flutes reflected the harsh glare of the paparazzi flashes that had become a constant companion to Serafina's life. Julian, his usually impeccable composure fractured, reached for her hand, his touch hesitant. The scent of lilies, her favorite, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of betrayal in her mouth. "Sarah," he began, his voice a low rumble against the backdrop of the party's muted chatter. "Please, let me explain." She withdrew her hand, the gesture sharp and decisive. The diamonds on her fingers, a testament to their shared prosperity, felt cold and heavy. "Explain what, Julian? The stolen kisses captured by the ever-vigilant lens of the press? Or the whispered secrets shared in shadowy corners, away from the blinding light of our carefully curated facade?" Her voice, though controlled, trembled with barely suppressed fury. He flinched, his gaze dropping to the swirling champagne in his glass. The crystal seemed to magnify his own internal turmoil, the guilt, the desperation, the fear. He'd known this moment was coming, but the reality of it, the raw emotion in Serafina's eyes, was far more devastating than he'd anticipated. The meticulously constructed image of their perfect life lay shattered around them, a testament to his reckless actions. The opulent room, usually a symbol of their success, now felt like a gilded cage. The murmur of conversations felt like whispers of judgment. Each clinking glass echoed the fragility of their marriage, the imminent collapse of their carefully crafted world. The weight of their public image, once a source of pride, now felt like a suffocating burden. The scent of lilies, once a symbol of their love, now felt cloyingly sweet, a cruel reminder of what was lost. Julian knew that explaining would be a long, painful process, proving himself innocent even more challenging. The shadows cast by the encroaching scandal seemed to deepen. Their private hell had become a public spectacle. The mahogany table in Serafina's lawyer's office felt cold beneath her trembling hands. The scent of expensive leather and old paper did little to soothe the churning in her stomach. Outside, the city hummed, a relentless symphony of indifference to her private turmoil. Divorce papers, crisp and unforgiving, lay spread before her, a stark testament to the wreckage of her marriage. Each clause felt like a tiny hammer blow against her already fractured heart. "He's offered a substantial settlement," Mr. Davies, her lawyer, said, his voice smooth but lacking genuine warmth. The words felt hollow, meaningless against the backdrop of her shattered world. "More than generous, actually." Serafina managed a brittle laugh, the sound catching in her throat. "Generous? He's offering me money to buy back my silence, my dignity, my life." Tears welled, blurring the already indistinct print of the legal jargon. The ache in her chest was a physical thing, a constant reminder of the betrayal. Mr. Davies leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "He's clearly trying to salvage his reputation, Serafina. This affair has been damaging to both of you." "Damaging?" she repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "He's destroyed me. He's taken everything." She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms, a desperate attempt to ground herself in the midst of the swirling chaos. The photographs, the relentless media scrutiny, the whispers and stares. It was all too much. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a puppet dangling on the strings of public opinion. A subtle shift in her perspective occurred. A flicker of doubt, a tiny seed planted by the whispers she'd overheard about Julian's clandestine trips to a specialized clinic. Genetic testing. What if? The thought, fragile and unwelcome, took root. Could there be more to this story than met the eye? Could there be a truth hidden beneath the layers of betrayal? The question hung in the air, a silent promise of a possible different narrative. The settlement, once a symbol of finality, now seemed like a temporary reprieve, a pause before the next act in this devastating drama. The champagne, the lilies, the glittering facade, it all felt like a distant memory, a life she no longer recognized. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the opulence of Serafina's penthouse apartment. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays, a poignant metaphor for the fragility of her world. She clutched the lab results, the crisp white paper trembling in her hand. The words blurred, a jumble of scientific jargon that held the potential to shatter her already fractured reality. What does it mean, heiress? Her voice was barely a whisper, raw with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Dr. Thorne, his face obscured by shadow, leaned back in his expensive leather chair. The low hum of the city outside was a constant, muted backdrop to the charged silence in the room. His expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask that hid his true intentions. "It means," he began, his voice smooth as polished marble, "that the paternity of your child is not what you believe." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Serafina felt the blood drain from her face. The champagne flutes, the laughter, the carefully curated image of marital bliss. It all dissolved into a nauseating miasma of betrayal and uncertainty. The weight of the accusations, the public humiliation, the bitter taste of her own tears, it all seemed meaningless now. But Julian, she choked on the words, the name tasting like ash. Doubt, that tiny seed planted in the lawyer's office, had blossomed into a thorny vine, twisting around her heart. Dr. Thorne remained silent, his gaze fixed on something beyond her, somewhere in the vast expanse of the city sprawling beneath them. The city, a silent witness to her unraveling. The weight of his silence was almost unbearable, amplifying the frantic beat of her heart. Each second stretched, an eternity of suspense. "The results are inconclusive," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "Further testing is required. There are complications." His eyes, finally meeting hers, held a glint that chilled her to the bone. A hint of something dark, something calculated, flickered in their depths. The implications of his words hung heavy. A new kind of betrayal, a far deeper deception, was beginning to unfold. The preliminary results were a mere prelude to a truth that promised to shake her world to its core. The city lights, once a comforting distance, now felt like a menacing, watchful presence. The penthouse hummed with a low, thrumming energy, a stark contrast to the icy silence that had settled between Serafina and Julian. Crystal glasses, half filled with forgotten champagne, reflected the flickering city lights, their sparkle mocking the fractured state of their marriage. The air, thick with unspoken accusations, carried the faint scent of lilies, a floral funeral pyre for their once perfect life. Julian, his usually impeccably tailored suit slightly rumpled, paced restlessly. His normally confident gait was hesitant. His shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. He stopped abruptly, his gaze settling on Serafina. She sat rigidly on a plush velvet chaise lounge, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the lab results clutched like a lifeline. "Serafina," he began, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the hushed atmosphere. I need you to understand." She didn't meet his eyes, her gaze fixed on the swirling patterns of the Persian rug beneath her feet. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, filled only by the distant city sounds and the erratic drumming of her heart. "Understand what, Julian?" Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a chilling testament to her emotional exhaustion. The carefully constructed facade of composure began to crack. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the meticulously applied makeup. "That I never intended to hurt you. This wasn't how it was supposed to be." His voice cracked slightly, a vulnerability that felt alien and unsettling. She finally looked up, her eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence and life, now dull and clouded with pain. But it was Julian. The photos, the whispers, the accusations. It all happened. The bitterness in her voice was palpable. "How can you possibly expect me to believe anything else?" He walked towards her, stopping just short of touching her. The distance felt like a chasm, an insurmountable gulf between them. The tests, Eris said there were complications. He hinted at something different. The mention of Dr. Thorne's cryptic words seemed to reignite a flicker of hope within her, a tiny ember in the ashes of her devastation. Yet, distrust remained a formidable barrier. The weight of the public spectacle, the relentless media scrutiny, the shattering of her carefully constructed image, it all threatened to overwhelm her. She needed answers, but she also feared the truth, whatever it may be. The city lights, once symbols of their glamorous life, now seemed to mock her vulnerability, their brilliance a stark contrast to the darkness closing in around her. The future, once so bright, was now shrouded in uncertainty. The paparazzi descended like a swarm of locusts, their flashes blinding, their lenses intrusive. Serafina shielded her face, the sharp sting of a flashbulb echoing the sharper sting of betrayal. The headlines screamed across the tabloids. "Architect's affair shakes society." Julian's carefully crafted image, once a beacon of success and sophistication, crumbled before her eyes. The penthouse, usually a haven of calm elegance, felt claustrophobic. Each gilded frame, each carefully chosen piece of art, mocked their shattered reality. The scent of lilies, Serafina's favorite, now felt suffocating, a cloying sweetness clinging to the bitter taste of disillusionment. "It's a lie," Julian pleaded, his voice raw with desperation. His usually impeccable composure was shattered, replaced by a frantic energy that only amplified Serafina's growing anger. He held out his hands, palms up, as if offering himself up for judgment. "I swear, Serafina, there's more to this than meets the eye." She stared at him, her eyes cold and distant. The carefully constructed wall of composure she'd maintained in public began to crumble. Tears welled, blurring her vision, but she refused to let them fall. More? What more could there possibly be? The photographs speak for themselves. The accusations echoed in the opulent space, bouncing off the marble floors and silk walls. The weight of public opinion, the crushing judgment of society, bore down on them both. Julian's attempts at damage control, the carefully crafted press releases, only served to further fuel the flames of speculation. Serafina felt the icy tendrils of public scorn wrapping around her, threatening to suffocate her. She felt the familiar burn of injustice, but beneath it, a cold, hard seed of doubt began to take root. Julian's desperation, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. It was different from the calculated charm she'd grown accustomed to. It planted a tiny, fragile seed of hope in the desolate landscape of her heartbreak, a whisper of a possibility that this wasn't the whole truth. The city lights, normally symbols of their glamorous world, were now menacing, their brilliance a stark reminder of the public spectacle that had consumed them. The weight of it all threatened to crush them both, leaving only the ruins of their perfect life in its wake. The divorce lawyers, sharks in tailored suits, circled like vultures. The air in the sterile courtroom hung thick with the scent of expensive perfume and simmering resentment. Serafina, her usually vibrant silk scarf replaced by a severe black one, felt the weight of every whispered judgment. Julian, pale and gaunt, sat across from her, his eyes haunted. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack echoing the shattering of their life together. "The court grants the divorce," the judge's voice boomed, each word a hammer blow to Serafina's already fragile composure. The finality of it hit her with a physical force, a wave of nausea threatening to sweep her under. She clutched her handbag, the leather cold against her trembling fingers. That night, the penthouse felt vast and empty. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, each second a reminder of time irrevocably lost. Serafina stared out at the city lights, a million pinpricks of shimmering indifference. The champagne flutes, once symbols of celebration, now seemed to mock her solitude. She poured herself a glass, the icy liquid doing little to soothe the burning in her throat. A soft knock echoed through the apartment. It was her assistant, Clara, her face etched with worry. "There's something. I found this in your email," Clara said, her voice hushed, handing her a single sheet of paper. It was a laboratory report. Genetic testing. Julian's name. A seed of doubt, tiny but tenacious, began to sprout in the barren landscape of her grief. Could there be more to the story than the scandalous headlines suggested? The possibility, however faint, sparked a flicker of hope amidst the ashes of her shattered world. The cold certainty of betrayal began to crack, leaving room for a sliver of something else: uncertainty, maybe even curiosity. The city lights, once symbols of her glamorous life, now felt like distant stars, cold and unreachable. But something had shifted. The weight of the accusations felt slightly lighter, replaced by a new, unsettling burden: the weight of the unknown. The report felt brittle in Serafina's trembling fingers. Julian's name, stark and official, stared back at her from the sterile white paper. The penthouse, usually a haven of luxury, felt claustrophobic. Each expensive detail, the Murano glass chandelier, the silk-draped furniture, mocked her desolation. Clara, her ever-loyal assistant, watched with a mixture of concern and apprehension, her own eyes mirroring the city's shimmering, indifferent lights outside. "What does it mean, Clara?" Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the city. Clara hesitated. It says he's undergoing genetic testing, but there's no further explanation." The weight of the divorce still pressed down on Serafina, a physical burden that made breathing difficult. Betrayal had been the undeniable narrative, a story etched in the harsh glare of the paparazzi's flashbulbs and the judge's cold pronouncements. Now, this cryptic report offered a crack in that certainty, a sliver of doubt in the seemingly unshakable truth. She paced the length of the vast living room, the plush carpet muffling her steps but not the turmoil within. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now felt like a bitter mockery of her shattered life. The taste was acrid, leaving a metallic tang on her tongue. Each sip was a tiny rebellion against the overwhelming grief, a desperate attempt to numb the sharp edges of her pain. "It's unsettling," she finally said, her voice catching in her throat. The image of Julian, his face etched with worry and guilt during the divorce proceedings, flashed through her mind. Had he been hiding something else? Something bigger than the affair? Clara nodded, her sympathy palpable. "I know. I'll try to find out more. Perhaps Dr. Thorne?" The report mentions his laboratory. The name, Dr. Eris Thorne, a name whispered only in hushed tones within the elite circles of the city's wealthiest, sent a fresh wave of unease through Serafina. The thought of contacting him, of delving deeper into this unsettling mystery, was both terrifying and strangely compelling. A new, dangerous curiosity warred with her ingrained sense of betrayal and hurt. The city lights outside, once representing her glamorous, seemingly perfect life, now pulsed with a different energy. The pulse of a mystery unfolding, a truth yet to be revealed. The weight of the unknown was heavy, but it felt lighter than the crushing weight of her certainty. The next morning, sunlight, harsh and unforgiving, sliced through the sheer curtains of Serafina's penthouse. The champagne hangover clung to her like a second skin, a bitter reminder of the previous night's desperate attempt at self-medication. Clara, ever practical, had already brewed strong coffee, the rich aroma a slight improvement on the metallic tang of yesterday's regrets. "I called Dr. Thorne's office," Clara said, her voice low, concerned. "His assistant was evasive, said he's exceptionally busy, unavailable for appointments." Serafina's gaze drifted to the city sprawling beneath her, a glittering tapestry woven with secrets. "Busy or hiding something?" she murmured, the question hanging in the air between them, thick with unspoken suspicion. The seed of doubt, planted yesterday, had sprouted overnight, its roots twisting through her carefully constructed world. I also managed to get a copy of the initial blood work request, Clara continued, placing a folder on the sleek glass table. Serafina picked it up, her fingers tracing the crisp lines of the form. Julian's name was there, undeniable, yet the purpose of the test remained shrouded in mystery. A gnawing unease settled in her stomach. It wasn't just the affair anymore. This felt larger, more sinister. This changes everything, Clara, Serafina said, her voice tight. The image of Julian, his face etched with a blend of guilt and something else, fear, flashed through her mind. The carefully crafted narrative of betrayal felt flimsy, ready to crumble under the weight of this new uncertainty. It certainly does, Clara agreed, her eyes reflecting the growing unease in Serafina's own. But finding out the truth, that might be more dangerous than we think. The unspoken implication hung between them. Dr. Thorne, with his enigmatic reputation and close ties to the city's elite, might be more than just a geneticist. He might be the key to unlocking a far more complex truth, a truth that could shatter everything they thought they knew. The city, once a symbol of Serafina's success, now pulsed with a different energy, the ominous thrum of an impending revelation. The mahogany courtroom felt cold, despite the hushed murmurs and the low hum of fluorescent lights. Serafina sat rigidly, the scent of expensive perfume a stark contrast to the acrid tang of anxiety clinging to her. Julian, across the polished table, looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, etched not just by time but by the relentless pressure of the scandal. His gaze, usually so confident, held a flicker of something akin to fear. "This is absurd," Julian's lawyer, a sleek woman with a voice like ice, stated. "My client maintains his innocence. The accusations are baseless." Serafina felt a surge of anger, a bitter taste on her tongue. Baseless? The paparazzi photos, the whispered conversations, the sheer weight of public opinion. These weren't baseless. But a new uncertainty gnawed at her, a seed of doubt planted by the cryptic conversation with Clara and the ominous implications of the genetic test request. She opened her mouth to speak, but the judge's gavel silenced her. The weight of the legal proceedings pressed down, each carefully worded statement, each objection, adding another layer to the suffocating pressure. The air thrummed with unspoken accusations, veiled threats, and the raw, exposed nerves of two people whose lives had been publicly dissected. The session adjourned, leaving Serafina feeling more hollowed out than before. The sharp scent of antiseptic from the courtroom still clung to her as she stepped out into the blinding sunlight. The city noise was a jarring contrast to the sterile quiet of the courtroom, the cacophony a physical assault on her frayed nerves. Clara's hand found hers, warm and reassuring. "It's not over," Clara said, her voice a low comfort against the roar of the city. "We still have the test results. And we'll find out the truth, Serafina, whatever it is." Serafina looked at Clara, then back at the towering skyscrapers, symbols of wealth and success that now felt like cold, indifferent giants. The truth, whatever it may be, was now her only anchor in the storm of doubt and betrayal. The seed of suspicion, once tiny, had taken root, promising a harvest far more complex and unsettling than she could have ever imagined. The divorce proceedings weren't just a battle over assets. They were a fight for the truth, a fight for her sanity, and a fight for the very identity she once held dear. The sterile white of Dr. Thorne's office felt like a stark contrast to the opulent chaos of Serafina's life. Sunlight sliced through the blinds, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock, was oppressive. Serafina's perfectly manicured nails dug into the plush leather of the waiting room chair. Each tick felt like a hammer blow against the fragile composure she'd painstakingly constructed. "Ms. Morrow," Dr. Thorne's voice, smooth as polished granite, cut through the silence. He emerged from the inner office, his eyes, sharp and assessing, met hers. There was an unsettling calmness about him, a detached professionalism that unnerved her. She rose, her carefully crafted facade threatening to crumble. "Doctor," her voice was barely a whisper, brittle with anxiety. He gestured towards the inner office. "Please, come in." The office was minimalist, almost monastic, the only embellishment a single, stark orchid in a sleek glass vase. The air hummed with the low thrum of unseen machinery, a constant reminder of the scientific precision at work within these walls. He handed her a sealed envelope. "The results are preliminary, but significant." His tone was carefully neutral, devoid of any emotion, yet the slight tremor in his hand betrayed his own apprehension. Serafina's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. The crisp paper felt cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the burning heat rising in her chest. Her breath hitched. The words swam before her eyes, blurring in a kaleidoscope of uncertainty. Doubt, a small seed planted weeks ago, had blossomed into a poisonous vine, choking the life out of her carefully constructed reality. The weight of the implications pressed down, heavy and suffocating, threatening to drown her in a sea of unanswered questions. She looked up at Dr. Thorne, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. "What does it mean?" Her voice was barely audible, a fragile thread in the suffocating silence. The preliminary results felt like a physical blow. The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the metallic tang of fear that filled Serafina's mouth. She stared at the document, the stark black lettering a stark contrast to the pristine white paper. The words swam, refusing to coalesce into a coherent meaning. The rhythmic ticking of the clock in Dr. Thorne's office became a relentless drumbeat against the silence, each tick a hammer blow to her already shattered composure. What does it mean?" she whispered, her voice a threadbare whisper lost in the cavernous silence. The single orchid, a splash of vibrant purple against the stark white walls, seemed to mock her turmoil. Dr. Thorne, his expression carefully masked, leaned forward, the movement somehow both predatory and cautious. "It suggests a discrepancy. The genetic markers don't align with Mr. Moreau's profile." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. The sunlight, previously a source of sterile illumination, now felt like a spotlight highlighting her vulnerability. Panic clawed at Serafina's throat. The carefully constructed facade she'd presented to the world, the veneer of composure, threatened to shatter completely. Tears pricked at her eyes, blurring the already confusing data. Betrayal, she thought, but this wasn't the betrayal she had expected. This was something deeper, more unsettling. So, Julian isn't? The question hung in the air, unfinished, choked with a rising tide of disbelief. Dr. Thorne offered no easy answers, only a carefully calibrated silence. He adjusted his glasses, the glint of the metal frames catching the light. "The test results are inconclusive, Ms. Moreau. Further analysis is required. But the initial findings are significant." His words hung in the air, each syllable weighted with an unspoken implication. Serafina felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, a flicker of it, at the potential unraveling of her public humiliation. Confusion, a vast and bewildering expanse, and a raw, visceral sense of violation. The life she had known, the carefully constructed narrative of love and betrayal, was crumbling, leaving behind only dust and unanswered questions. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her throat, the cool, smooth leather of her purse a meager comfort against the sudden chill of uncertainty. The world tilted, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. The opulent chaos of her life now felt distant, replaced by the sterile, horrifying truth contained within that single, thin sheet of paper. The seed of doubt had blossomed into a poisonous flower, and the scent was anything but sweet. The courtroom air hung thick with the scent of expensive perfume and simmering resentment. Serafina, her silk dress a stark contrast to the stark reality of her situation, sat rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of the mahogany chair. Julian, across the room, looked a shadow of his former self, the vibrant energy that had once characterized him replaced by a weary slump. The judge's gavel, a relentless symbol of their unraveling, echoed the pounding in Serafina's temples. "Ms. Moreau," the lawyer's voice, sharp and precise, sliced through the suffocating silence. Your testimony regarding Mr. Moreau's alleged infidelity remains central to this case. Serafina swallowed, the dryness in her throat mirroring the emptiness in her heart. The carefully constructed facade of outrage, maintained for weeks, felt like a brittle mask threatening to crack at any moment. "It remains true," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying a weight far exceeding its volume. The words felt alien, hollow echoes of a narrative now riddled with doubt. The lawyer pressed on, relentlessly dissecting their fractured life, each question a fresh wound. The courtroom, a gilded cage of legal maneuvering, seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on Serafina, suffocating her with the weight of public scrutiny and personal turmoil. She felt Julian's gaze, a mixture of sorrow and accusation, burning into her. The icy resistance she'd maintained throughout the proceedings wavered. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the meticulously applied makeup, a silent testament to the inner war raging within her. The judge called a recess, a brief respite in the relentless storm. Serafina fled to the hushed solitude of a restroom, the cool porcelain of the sink a fleeting comfort against the burning heat of her humiliation. Looking into the mirror, she saw not the powerful artist the world knew, but a woman broken, vulnerable, drowning in a sea of doubt. The genetic test results, inconclusive yet unsettling, had cracked the foundation of her narrative, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Betrayal, or something far more complex? The question echoed in the sterile space, a haunting refrain in the symphony of her despair. The bitter taste of betrayal was mingled with a new, unsettling flavor, the possibility of a truth far more devastating than any infidelity. The recess ended, but the quiet turmoil within her continued, a storm gathering force, threatening to consume her entirely. The cool porcelain of the sink offered little solace. Serafina stared at her reflection, the harsh fluorescent light illuminating the fragility beneath the carefully constructed mask. The lawyer's words echoed, a relentless mantra drilling into her already fractured psyche. Betrayal. The word tasted like ash in her mouth, a bitter residue clinging to the back of her throat. But the genetic test results, a cryptic whisper of uncertainty, muddied the waters, introducing a chilling element of doubt. Was this simply a case of infidelity, or something far more complex, far more insidious? The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the overwhelming aroma of her own fear. Each passing second felt heavier, the silence of the restroom amplifying the turmoil within. The faint tap-tap-tap of someone's heels against the polished floor echoed, and she instinctively straightened, pulling herself together. She couldn't afford to crumble. Not now. Emerging from the restroom, she found Julian waiting. His face, etched with exhaustion and a profound sadness that went beyond the superficial hurt of a public scandal, mirrored her own turmoil. He reached out, a tentative gesture, his hand hovering near hers before falling back to his side. The unspoken apology hung in the air between them, thick and heavy, suffocating. "Serafina," he began, his voice a low murmur. "The test, don't," she interrupted, her voice raspy. "Don't try to explain. Not now." She needed time, space to process the shattering of her carefully built world. The accusations, the public humiliation, the relentless media frenzy. It was all overwhelming. Now, this uncertainty gnawed at her, a relentless doubt that threatened to consume her entirely. He nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. The shared burden of their imploding world hung between them, a tangible weight in the tense silence. The air crackled with unspoken words, with hidden truths that neither was prepared to confront. The judge's gavel, a distant echo from the courtroom, felt less like a symbol of legal proceedings and more like a hammer blow to their shared reality. The recess felt less like a pause and more like a chasm opening beneath their feet. The uncertainty, the gnawing fear of what lay ahead, overshadowed even the bitter taste of betrayal. The truth, whatever it may be, was waiting, and it promised to be far more devastating than either of them could imagine. The mahogany door of Dr. Eris Thorne's office felt heavy, imbued with the weight of Serafina's unspoken anxieties. The air conditioning hummed a monotonous counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of her heart. The scent of expensive leather and antiseptic clashed, a jarring olfactory representation of her current state. Opulent yet sterile, controlled yet chaotic. Dr. Thorne, a man whose tailored suit seemed to absorb the light, gestured to a chair opposite his imposing desk. "Ms. Morrow, please sit." His voice, a smooth baritone, was devoid of warmth. Serafina sat, the plush velvet sinking beneath her. "The results," she began, her voice barely a whisper, each word a fragile stepping stone across a chasm of uncertainty. "Are complex," Thorne replied, his gaze unwavering. He tapped a slim file, the polished surface gleaming under the desk lamp. The initial tests indicated discrepancies. Discrepancies. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Serafina's breath hitched. The gnawing doubt from the courtroom had bloomed into a chilling certainty. This wasn't just about Julian's alleged infidelity. It was about the very foundation of her life. He pushed the file across the desk. "These are the full results. Take your time." Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the crisp pages. Medical jargon swam before her eyes, blurring into a chaotic vortex of numbers and scientific terms. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat accompanying the silent unraveling of her reality. The sterile scent of the office suddenly intensified, suffocating her. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. A diagram, stark and clinical, caught her eye. It illustrated a family tree, a stark visual representation of her own fractured reality. A name, unfamiliar yet somehow chillingly familiar, was circled in red. A name that shattered the carefully constructed narrative of her life. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the stark lines of the diagram, blurring the truth that was slowly, agonizingly, unfolding before her. Who is this?" she managed to ask, her voice choked with a mix of fear and dawning comprehension. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, a physical burden she could barely bear. The room, once suffocatingly sterile, now felt vast and empty, reflecting the hollowness that had begun to consume her. The elegant furnishings, the meticulously crafted space, seemed to mock her internal chaos. The silence, once tense, now felt deafening, a void echoing the uncertainty that had swallowed her whole. The truth, like a tidal wave, was about to crash over her. The crisp paper felt brittle under Serafina's trembling fingers. The sterile scent of Dr. Thorne's office, a heady mix of antiseptic and expensive leather, seemed to amplify the tremor in her hands. Outside, the Parisian twilight cast long shadows, a stark contrast to the brightly lit, clinical space. She reread the name circled in red, Jean-Luc Dubois. The name held no immediate resonance, yet a chilling premonition settled in her stomach, cold and heavy. Who is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. Tears pricked her eyes, blurring the stark lines of the genetic diagram. The carefully constructed facade of her life, the seemingly perfect marriage, the public image of a successful artist, it all crumbled before her. Dr. Thorne remained impassive, his tailored suit seeming to absorb the emotional turmoil radiating from Serafina. "Mr. Dubois," he said, his voice a low, measured tone, "was a colleague of yours, a distant acquaintance, perhaps, but the genetic evidence is irrefutable." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A colleague? Serafina racked her memory, sifting through the hazy landscape of gallery openings, art shows, and social gatherings. A flood of faces swam before her eyes, yet none coalesced into a clear image of Jean-Luc Dubois. I don't remember him," she stammered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The revelation felt surreal, a bizarre twist in a narrative already riddled with betrayal and deceit. The anger she'd felt towards Julian, the raw ache of betrayal, now felt misplaced, confused, a hollow echo in the vast cavern of her uncertainty. Dr. Thorne leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The results indicate he is the biological father of your child. He paused, his gaze unwavering. This information, it changes everything. Serafina felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Everything, her marriage, her public image, her very understanding of her own life. The carefully crafted narrative she'd clung to was shattered, reduced to fragments of a fractured reality. The lavish parties, the public appearances, the opulent trappings of her life, they all felt tainted, hollow. The truth, it seemed, was far more complex, far more devastating than she could have ever imagined. The comfortable numbness of her carefully constructed reality gave way to a chilling, terrifying emptiness. The silence that followed felt vast and echoing, reflecting the hollowness that had begun to consume her. The Parisian twilight deepened, casting long shadows across the ornate furniture of Serafina's penthouse apartment. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now sat untouched, a bitter reminder of a shattered life. She stared out at the glittering cityscape, the twinkling lights mocking her inner turmoil. The news, Jean-Luc Dubois, hung in the air like a suffocating cloud. A colleague? A distant acquaintance? The name evoked nothing, a blank space in her memory. Yet the genetic evidence was undeniable. "It's unbelievable," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Her reflection in the vast window showed a woman ravaged by doubt and confusion. The carefully constructed facade, the successful artist, the glamorous wife was cracking, revealing a vulnerable, fractured woman underneath. A soft knock at the door broke through her reverie. It was her closest friend, Isabel, her face etched with concern. Isabel, a constant in Serafina's life, her rock amidst the storm. Her eyes held a mixture of sympathy and understanding. "Darling," Isabel said softly, entering the apartment. "I've brought you something stronger than champagne." She held up a steaming mug. "Herbal tea. Something calming." Serafina managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Isabel. I need it." Isabel settled onto the plush sofa beside her, her hand resting reassuringly on Serafina's. "This Dubois, was he handsome?" she asked cautiously, her tone hinting at a line of questioning Serafina hadn't considered. The question, seemingly innocent, struck a nerve. Serafina flinched, a wave of nausea washing over her. The thought of another man, another connection, added a layer of complexity to the already overwhelming situation. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's all a blur. A lifetime of carefully curated social events. 1,000 faces. How could I remember one specific man?" Isabel squeezed her hand. "It's all right, darling. You don't have to remember. Just breathe. We'll figure this out together." The warmth of Isabel's hand and the comforting words were a lifeline in the sea of her uncertainty. The weight of the revelation, the crushing weight of betrayal, shifted slightly. There was still confusion, still pain, but amidst the storm, a flicker of hope ignited. The investigation into Jean-Luc Dubois hadn't even begun. Yet a new quest for truth had already started. A quest that wouldn't just determine the father of her child, but also redefine her own identity, her own sense of self. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Serafina's clothes, a phantom smell clinging to her even after leaving Dr. Thorne's office. The Parisian afternoon sun, usually a source of comfort, felt harsh, its rays emphasizing the shadows under her eyes. Doubt, a gnawing, persistent beast, had taken root, twisting her carefully constructed world into a chaotic mess. The champagne bubbles, once symbols of celebration, now tasted like ashes in her mouth. She'd walked home, numb, each footstep echoing the hollowness inside her. Reaching her apartment, the familiar opulence felt suffocating. The priceless artwork, once a source of pride, now seemed to mock her. She sank onto the plush velvet sofa, the soft fabric offering little solace. The weight of the potential truth pressed down on her. Could Julian, her husband, the man she thought she knew intimately, be capable of such deception? Or was there something else entirely at play? Her phone vibrated. A text from Isabel. "Met with lawyer. He thinks this could unravel everything. Call when you can. Isabel, her steadfast friend, was her only lifeline in this storm. The phone remained untouched. Serafina needed time. Time to absorb the shock, to reconcile the image of Julian, the loving and devoted husband, with the shadow of a man capable of a betrayal on such a grand scale. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Betrayal? Perhaps it wasn't betrayal at all. Perhaps it was something far more insidious, far more complex. The apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt like a cage. She wandered to the balcony. The city lights a mesmerizing yet distant spectacle. The cool night air offered a momentary reprieve from the internal tempest. Below, the city throbbed with life, oblivious to her turmoil. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to the fragility of her carefully built world. The genetic test results were only a preliminary glimpse. A deeper, darker truth lay hidden, waiting to be unearthed. And the quest to find it would lead her down a path she could scarcely imagine. The weight of her unanswered questions, heavier than any accusation, settled upon her. The Parisian dawn painted the sky in hues of rose and gold, a stark contrast to the gray turmoil churning inside Serafina. Isabel's text echoed in her mind. Asterisk. He thinks this could unravel everything. Asterisk unravel? The word felt too small, too delicate for the seismic shift occurring within her. The plush velvet sofa, once a comfort, now felt like a suffocating embrace. She rose, the silk of her pajama top whispering against her skin, a futile attempt at solace. The city below, awash in the morning light, seemed to hum with a life she couldn't quite access. A wave of nausea hit her, a physical manifestation of her emotional turmoil. She stumbled to the bathroom, the cool porcelain of the sink a welcome contrast to her burning skin. The phone buzzed again. Julian. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the device. The image of him, his usually warm brown eyes clouded with a desperate plea, flickered in her mind. Should she answer? What could he possibly say that wouldn't further fracture their already shattered reality? Finally, she swiped the call to voicemail. His message was brief, laced with a strained calm that sounded more like a plea than an assertion. Serafina, I need to talk. It's about the tests. Please call me back. The silence following the message felt deafening, heavier than any accusation. She leaned against the cool marble countertop, staring into her reflection, a ghost of the woman she once was. The lines around her eyes, usually softened by makeup, now spoke of sleepless nights and relentless anxiety. The sparkle in her usually vibrant eyes had dimmed, replaced by a weary uncertainty. A single, defiant tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. Unravel, she whispered, the word barely audible above the city's low hum. It's already unraveling, Julian, and I don't know if I even want to put it back together. The weight of the unknown, of the potential betrayals both subtle and overt, pressed down on her. This wasn't just about a broken marriage. It was about the shattering of her self-perception, the dismantling of everything she had believed to be true. The day stretched before her, uncertain, full of possibilities both terrifying and liberating. The quest for answers had begun. The penthouse suite felt colder than usual, the opulent furnishings offering little comfort. Serafina traced the rim of a half-empty glass of wine, the amber liquid mirroring the uncertainty swirling within her. The Parisian dawn, a pale imitation of the vibrant sunrise Isabel had described, cast long shadows across the room. Julian's message replayed in her mind, a persistent echo in the silence. It's about the tests, he'd pleaded. She pushed herself away from the opulent velvet sofa, its plush texture suddenly repulsive against her skin. The scent of lilies, usually a source of comfort, now felt cloying, almost suffocating. Each breath was a shallow gasp, her chest tight with a mixture of fear and a simmering, unfamiliar anger. The betrayal, if it was a betrayal, felt different now, less a blatant act of infidelity and more a subtle erosion of trust, a slow poisoning of her soul. A sharp knock on the door jolted her. Isabel, her longtime friend, stood in the doorway, her usually bright eyes shadowed with concern. "Serafina? Are you all right?" Serafina managed a weak smile. "Just processing things, I suppose." Julian's message. "It's about the genetic tests." Isabel stepped inside, her presence a warm counterpoint to the chill of the room. "He mentioned something about that last night. Said it could change everything." She paused, her gaze searching Serafina's face. "What do you think it means?" Serafina shrugged, the movement heavy with exhaustion. "I don't know, Isabel. I truly don't. All I know is that the ground beneath my feet feels like shifting sand." The wine tasted bitter, ash in her mouth. The thought of facing the results, facing the possibility of a truth far stranger than any infidelity, sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, trying to find purchase in the unsteady present. The waiting felt worse than any answer could be. The unraveling, she realized, was only just beginning. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the opulent perfume clinging to Serafina's clothes. Dr. Thorne's office was a minimalist haven of polished steel and cool glass, the antithesis of her chaotic life. He sat behind a vast desk, the genetic report nestled amongst meticulously organized files. His eyes, the color of glacial ice, held a disconcerting calm. "The results are unexpected, Mrs. Moreau," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. The formality felt like a deliberate barrier. Serafina's hands trembled as she accepted the document. The crisp paper felt alien against her skin, a fragile shield against the storm brewing inside her. She'd imagined a clear-cut answer, a definitive yes or no. This was different. A cold dread coiled in her stomach. "Unexpected how?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper against the silence. The weight of the past weeks, the accusations, the public humiliation, pressed down on her like a physical burden. Dr. Thorne leaned forward, the gesture unsettlingly intimate. "The paternity test. It indicates a discrepancy. Your child's DNA does not match Mr. Moreau's." He paused, watching her react. The blood drained from Serafina's face, leaving her feeling lightheaded. The room tilted slightly, the antiseptic scent suddenly sharp and suffocating. "But, Julian," she choked out, the words catching in her throat. The man she'd loved, the man she'd accused, the man who'd been torn apart by public scorn. He wasn't the father? The revelation was so profoundly unsettling. It threatened to shatter her perception of reality. Isabel, sitting beside her, reached out a comforting hand. Serafina squeezed it tightly, the physical contact grounding her in the dizzying present. Tears stung her eyes, blurring the crisp lines of the report. Betrayal, she realized with a sickening jolt, took many forms. The public spectacle, the cruel whispers, the shattered image had all been based on a lie. But what kind of lie? And who was responsible? The questions, sharp and agonizing, pierced the numbness. The unraveling, she thought, was far from over. It was only just beginning. Julian sat on the edge of his penthouse balcony, the city lights a shimmering tapestry below. The champagne flute in his hand remained untouched. The bubbly's effervescence mirrored the turmoil within him. The accusations had stung, yes, but the public humiliation was nothing compared to the gnawing secret he'd carried for months. He'd risked everything to protect her, to shield Serafina from a truth so devastating it could shatter her world. The cool night air did little to soothe the burn of guilt. He swirled the champagne, the liquid catching the city's glow. The genetic test, a desperate gamble, had been his only hope. He hadn't anticipated this level of public scrutiny, this frenzied media circus. The affair, the alleged affair, a carefully constructed lie to protect Serafina, a lie that had spun wildly out of control. He'd been prepared for her anger, her accusations. He hadn't expected the depth of her devastation, the raw pain that had etched itself onto her face. He longed to tell her the truth, to lay bare the years of carefully concealed anxieties that had driven him to such drastic measures. But how could he? The evidence, the damning paparazzi shots, were as real as the icy grip of fear in his chest. A tear traced a path down his cheek, a silent testament to the weight of his secret. He thought of Serafina's eyes, the way they had once held the boundless warmth of the Mediterranean sun. Now they reflected only the storm raging within her. He'd hoped the test results would bring some semblance of peace, some resolution to the escalating chaos. But the preliminary findings only hinted at a larger mystery, a labyrinth of deceit that he now felt trapped within. The truth, it seemed, was as elusive as ever. He drained the champagne, the bitter taste mirroring the poison of his deception. The city lights, once a beacon of hope, now felt like distant stars, unattainable and cold. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating, leaving him breathless and alone. He needed to find a way to make amends, to unravel the tangled web of lies he'd spun, before it completely consumed them both. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Serafina's clothes, a stark contrast to the plush velvet of the waiting room. Sunlight sliced through the tall windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the golden beams. She hadn't slept properly in days, the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a relentless counterpoint to the frantic beat of her heart. Doubt, a fragile seed planted by Julian's secretive genetic testing, had blossomed into a thorny vine, twisting around her certainty, choking her with its insidious tendrils. He wouldn't, she whispered, more to herself than the air. The words felt brittle, fragile things easily shattered. The thought of Julian's betrayal, so vehemently public, so viscerally painful, still clung to her like a shroud. But the whisper of another possibility, a different truth, was growing louder. A soft knock broke through her reverie. Dr. Eris Thorne entered, his face carefully neutral, his eyes, however, betraying a flicker of something akin to amusement. He held a file, its crisp edges sharp against the soft curve of his palm. "Ms. Devereux," he began, his voice a smooth baritone. "The preliminary results are unexpected." He paused, letting the weight of the word hang heavy in the air. Serafina's breath hitched. Unexpected how? Her voice trembled, betraying the turmoil within. The elegant furniture of the waiting room seemed to blur, the light dimming as if the room itself held its breath. Thorne met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "The genetic markers, they don't align with Mr. Moreau's. There's a discrepancy." He placed the file on the low table between them, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the trembling of Serafina's hands. A wave of nausea washed over her. It wasn't the relief she'd anticipated. It was something colder, something more profound. A violation, not of trust, but of something more fundamental, something woven into the very fabric of her being. Her child. The child she had assumed was Julian's. What does it mean? She finally managed, her voice a mere breath. Thorne leaned back, his expression now almost regretful. "It means the paternity is questionable." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The implication hung heavy, a suffocating blanket of uncertainty. Serafina felt a chill, despite the warm sunlight streaming through the windows. The world around her seemed to tilt, the elegant room transforming into a swirling vortex of confusion and fear. The truth, whatever it was about to shatter her world in a way the scandal never could. Julian sat on the balcony of his penthouse apartment, the city lights a glittering, indifferent backdrop to his turmoil. The champagne flute in his hand remained untouched, the bubbles mirroring the unease churning in his stomach. The preliminary genetic test results hung over him like a guillotine, a cold, metallic weight threatening to sever his already fragile composure. He hadn't anticipated this. The affair, a desperate attempt to protect a secret far more devastating than infidelity, now threatened to unravel everything. He ran a hand through his hair, the strands damp with sweat despite the cool night air. The lie, meticulously crafted and painstakingly maintained, felt like a suffocating cloak. He'd risked everything, his reputation, his marriage, to shield a truth far more complicated. A truth involving a past he'd desperately tried to bury. But the truth, like a stubborn weed, had pushed its way through the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. A sigh escaped his lips, ragged and burdened. He looked out at the city, the distant hum a counterpoint to the tempest raging within. He'd hoped the genetic test would provide a clean break, a way to silence the accusations, to regain some semblance of control. Instead, it had ignited a wildfire, threatening to consume him entirely. His phone vibrated, the sharp ring cutting through his reverie. He glanced at the screen, his heart quickening. It was Serafina's lawyer. He hesitated, the phone feeling like a burning coal in his palm. The call, he knew, would be anything but pleasant. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the inevitable onslaught. He pressed the button, the sharp click echoing the finality of the decision he'd already made. He would face the consequences, whatever they may be. The weight of his secret, once a suffocating burden, now felt strangely lighter, replaced by a chilling sense of inevitability. The lawyer's voice, crisp and devoid of sympathy, sliced through the silence. "Mr. Moreau," it began, each syllable precise and cold. "The preliminary results are inconclusive. However, there are anomalies that require further investigation." Julian gripped the champagne flute tighter, the crystal cold against his sweating palm. Inconclusive? That wasn't what he'd hoped for. He'd gambled everything on a clean slate, a simple exoneration. Instead, he was plunged deeper into the murky waters of uncertainty. He paced the length of the balcony, the city lights blurring into a shimmering, indistinct mess. The scent of expensive cigars, a familiar comfort, did little to soothe the turmoil within. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble rough against his skin, a physical manifestation of the rough patch his life had become. The weight of his secret, the desperate lie he'd woven, felt heavier now, a suffocating burden threatening to crush him. "What kind of anomalies?" he finally managed, his voice tight. "The paternity test. It's not definitive," the lawyer continued, his voice a low hum against the backdrop of the city's murmur. "But there are discrepancies that suggest, well, that the assumed paternity may be questionable." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Questionable. The word echoed the doubt that had been gnawing at him since he'd first conceived of this desperate plan. He closed his eyes, picturing Serafina's face, the raw pain etched on her features during their last encounter. The memory was a physical blow, each sharp detail a fresh wound. Had he done more harm than good? Had his attempts to protect her, to protect himself, only deepened the wounds? He opened his eyes, the city lights seeming to mock him with their careless brilliance. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, the metallic clang on the stone floor a jarring sound in the tense silence. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making, the consequences far more devastating than he'd ever imagined. The truth, he realized with a sickening lurch, was far more complicated, far more damaging, than the lie he'd so carefully constructed. And the price of that lie, he now understood, might be everything. The chipped porcelain of Serafina's teacup felt cool against her trembling fingers. Rain lashed against the tall windows of her penthouse apartment, mirroring the storm raging inside her. Isabel, her closest friend, sat opposite, her expression a mixture of concern and unwavering support. The scent of jasmine tea, usually soothing, did little to calm Serafina's frayed nerves. He said, "Inconclusive," Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Isabel reached across the small table, her hand covering Serafina's. "Inconclusive isn't good, darling. But it's not a confirmation either." Serafina shook her head, her dark hair swaying. "But it's something that casts a shadow on everything we thought we knew." She looked out at the city lights, blurred and indistinct through the rain-streaked glass. Each twinkling light felt like a tiny judgment, a silent accusation. "Julian's trying to protect himself," Isabel stated, her voice firm. "He's always been a man who controls his narrative. Maybe this ambiguity is his way of doing just that. Or maybe," Serafina countered, her voice raw, Maybe he's hiding something far worse than infidelity. The thought burrowed into her, cold and unsettling. The betrayal she'd felt had been visceral, a physical wound to her heart. But this uncertainty was a different kind of pain, a slow burn that threatened to consume her. Isabel squeezed Serafina's hand. "We need answers, and we'll get them. We'll find out the truth, whatever it may be." A sharp rap on the door punctuated their quiet conversation. Isabel rose, her movements fluid and graceful. "It's probably that journalist again," she murmured, a hint of annoyance in her voice. "The one who's been hounding us relentlessly." Serafina sighed. The media's insatiable hunger for the scandalous details of her life felt like another relentless storm, battering her from all sides. This investigation, this uncertainty, had opened a chasm in her world, threatening to swallow her whole. The truth, whatever it was, held the power to either shatter her completely or, perhaps, unexpectedly, set her free. The journalist, a sharp-featured woman named Anya Sharma, was persistent. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a glint of something Serafina couldn't quite decipher: professional curiosity or something more insidious. Isabel, ever the shield, intercepted her at the door, her voice a low, controlled murmur. The scent of Anya's expensive perfume, a sharp citrus, clashed with the lingering jasmine. "Ms. Sharma, I'm afraid Serafina isn't feeling well," Isabel said, her tone polite but firm. Anya's gaze, however, remained fixed on Serafina, who sat rigidly on the plush velvet sofa, the chipped teacup forgotten in her lap. The city lights, a shimmering tapestry outside the rain-lashed windows, felt mocking in their brilliance. "Ms. Moreau," Anya began, her voice low and smooth, "I understand you're undergoing some private testing. I have information that suggests the results might be unexpected." Her words hung in the air, each syllable laced with a subtle threat. Serafina felt a chill despite the warmth of the apartment. The uncertainty gnawed at her, a relentless, insidious beast. "What information?" she asked, her voice a mere breath. The tremor in her hands betrayed her composure. Anya leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Rumors circulate, whispers in the corridors of power. The results, should they be unfavorable, could shatter your carefully constructed image." Her gaze lingered on Serafina's face, searching for a flicker of fear or guilt. Serafina felt a surge of defiance. This wasn't just about the scandal anymore. It was about her life, her child, her very identity. Isabel stepped forward, her hand protectively on Serafina's arm. "We have nothing more to say to you, Ms. Sharma." The quiet strength in her voice, usually gentle, spoke volumes. Anya smiled, a slow, predatory curve of her lips. "I admire your loyalty, Ms. Dubois, but loyalty can be blind. And the truth, Ms. Moreau," she said, her gaze piercing Serafina's, "has a way of revealing itself, no matter how hard one tries to bury it." With a final, lingering look, she turned and left, the scent of citrus fading slowly into the rain-washed air. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The uncertainty, previously a subtle unease, now hung like a palpable presence in the room. Serafina looked at Isabel, her eyes wide with apprehension. The storm inside her raged on, fueled by fear, but also by a fierce, growing determination to find her own truth. The rain hammered against the penthouse windows, mirroring the tempest in Serafina's soul. Isabel, her ever-loyal friend, sat beside her, a silent presence offering comfort through mere proximity. The air hung thick with the scent of jasmine and unspoken anxieties. Serafina traced the rim of her chipped teacup, the delicate porcelain cold against her trembling fingers. Anya Sharma's words echoed in the opulent silence. Asterisk, "The truth has a way of revealing itself." Asterisk, "It's like a nightmare," Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Her eyes, usually sparkling with life, were clouded with a deep, unsettling fear. The meticulously crafted facade of her life, once a source of pride, now felt like a fragile mask about to shatter. Isabel squeezed her hand, her touch a grounding force in the swirling chaos. "We'll face this together, Serafina. Whatever the truth is, we'll face it." Her voice was steady, a comforting balm against Serafina's spiraling panic. The opulent penthouse, usually a symbol of Serafina's success, now felt like a gilded cage. The city lights, usually a captivating spectacle, were reduced to blurry streaks of color through the rain-streaked glass. Each shimmering light seemed to mock her vulnerability, her exposed uncertainty. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm Serafina. The possibility of a deception far deeper than Julian's alleged affair, the possibility of a lie at the very heart of her family, sent a chill down her spine. She thought of her child, their innocent face a beacon in the storm raging within her. "But what if it's not just Julian?" she choked out, the words catching in her throat. The fear, raw and visceral, was etched onto her face. Isabel's hand tightened on hers. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken dread, the rhythmic drumming of the rain the only punctuation. Suddenly, a sharp rapping at the door sliced through the tension. Isabel rose, her expression hardening. Another visitor. Another potential harbinger of more bad news. This time, it wasn't a journalist, but a sleek, black car pulled up below. A man exiting, his silhouette sharply defined against the downpour. He was tall, impeccably dressed, his presence exuding an aura of quiet power and controlled menace. Dr. Eris Thorne. The game was afoot. The rain lashed against the penthouse windows, a relentless percussion accompanying the turmoil within Serafina. Isabel, a comforting presence in her silk robe, poured more chamomile tea, the steam momentarily obscuring the city's glittering chaos. The scent of jasmine, usually a source of serene pleasure, now felt cloying, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. "He's here," Isabel said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the storm. She gestured towards the entrance, where a figure stood silhouetted against the hall's soft light. It was Mark, a journalist Serafina had initially despised, but whose dogged pursuit of the truth had, surprisingly, begun to earn a grudging respect. Mark entered, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored Serafina's own. He carried a worn leather briefcase, its contents, the latest revelations, radiating a palpable tension. "I have something," he began, his voice low and grave. He opened the briefcase, revealing a stack of papers, each one seemingly burdened with secrets. "More leaks?" Serafina asked, her voice a dry rasp. The initial shock of Julian's alleged affair had been eclipsed by a deeper, more chilling uncertainty. Mark shook his head. "No, this is different. It's about Thorne. I've uncovered a pattern, a series of irregularities in his past cases. Similar situations, women in high-profile relationships, genetic tests with discrepancies." Isabel's eyes widened. "Discrepancies? What kind of discrepancies?" Mark hesitated, the weight of the information heavy on his shoulders. "There's evidence suggesting a manipulation. Altered results, fabricated reports. He's not just a geneticist, Isabel. He's an orchestrator. And Serafina, you might be closer to the center of it than you realize." Serafina felt a cold dread creep into her bones. The opulent penthouse, once a sanctuary, now felt like a pressure cooker. The city lights, blurred and distorted by the rain, seemed to mock her vulnerability, the shimmering reflections dancing with the shadows of her fear. The possibility of a far-reaching conspiracy, a web of deceit far greater than Julian's supposed infidelity, threatened to engulf her entirely. The jasmine scent intensified, a suffocating perfume of anxiety. She took a shaky breath, the chamomile tea doing little to soothe the tremor in her hands. "What does it mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the relentless rain. Her gaze was fixed on Mark, her eyes desperate for clarity, for answers within the chaos. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the perfect tempest inside her. The truth, elusive and terrifying, was closer than she ever imagined. The preliminary results arrived in a plain, unmarked envelope, slipped discreetly under Serafina's door. The crisp white paper felt strangely cold against her trembling fingers. Inside, a single sheet, typed in a stark, impersonal font, contained the cryptic message. Inconsistencies noted. Further testing advised. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Serafina stared at the paper, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked window behind her. The champagne flutes from the previous night's party stood abandoned on the table, a mockery of the celebration that had been so abruptly shattered. The scent of lilies, her favorite, usually calming, now felt suffocating, mirroring the anxiety that clawed at her throat. A wave of nausea washed over her. The initial relief, the flicker of doubt that had sparked with Julian's secret testing, now morphed into something far more unsettling. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was about a deeper deception, a hidden truth that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew. Later that day, the sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air as Serafina confronted Dr. Thorne in his pristine laboratory. The polished chrome surfaces gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, creating an atmosphere of clinical detachment that did little to soothe her frayed nerves. "The results," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "they're ambiguous." Dr. Thorne, a man whose eyes seemed to hold the weight of countless secrets, leaned back in his chair, his expression inscrutable. "Ambiguity is often the precursor to revelation, Mrs. Moreau," he replied smoothly, his voice a low purr that grated on her already raw nerves. "The preliminary findings suggest a genetic anomaly, one that challenges the assumed paternity." Serafina's breath hitched. The implications hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet undeniably present. The sterile environment suddenly felt claustrophobic, the air thick with tension. "What does that mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the laboratory equipment. Dr. Thorne's gaze held hers. A flicker of something, was it pity? Or perhaps something far more sinister, crossing his features. "It means," he said slowly, each word carefully chosen, "that not everything is as it seems." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before adding, with a hint of cold amusement, "The truth, Mrs. Moreau, can be a very inconvenient thing." The silence that followed felt deafening, a stark counterpoint to the quiet hum of machines, each beep and were a relentless reminder of the unraveling of her life. The truth, she realized, was far more complex, far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The penthouse suite, usually a haven of calm, felt oppressive. Serafina paced, the plush carpet muffling her restless steps. The city sprawled beneath, a glittering tapestry indifferent to her turmoil. The cryptic message from Dr. Thorne echoed in her mind. Inconsistencies noted, further testing advised. Inconsistencies. The word felt like a physical blow, each syllable a hammer against her already fragile composure. Julian found her by the window, her silhouette etched against the cityscape. He reached out, his hand hesitant, hovering near her shoulder before retracting. "Darling," he began, his voice low, I need to know what's happening." Serafina whirled, her eyes flashing. "What's happening? You're the one who's been hiding things, Julian. Secret genetic tests? What were you expecting to find?" Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed facade of icy composure crumbling. Tears welled, blurring the lights of the city. He took a step closer, his expression pained. "It's not what you think," he began, then paused, struggling to find the words. The weight of his secret pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. "There are things I couldn't tell you. Not before." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing his inner turmoil. The usual assurance in his bearing was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that both frightened and touched her. "There are things you couldn't tell me?" she repeated, her voice laced with bitter sarcasm. "Like an affair with who? You can tell me now, Julian. Spill it all out. Let's get this over with." The sharp edge to her words was a defense mechanism, a shield against the vulnerability threatening to overwhelm her. He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the city below. It's not. It's not simple. It's about our child. He finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Serafina's breath caught in her throat. The initial anger, the accusations, the hurt, all seemed to fade, replaced by a chilling sense of dread. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about the very foundation of her life, about the child she held so dear. The champagne flutes, a stark reminder of her shattered celebrations, remained untouched, as if frozen in time, mirroring the suspended animation of her own life. The truth, whatever it was about to be unveiled, and Serafina braced herself for a revelation that could shatter her world. The sterile white of Dr. Thorne's laboratory felt a stark contrast to the opulent penthouse Serafina had left behind. The air hummed with the quiet thrum of machinery, a counterpoint to the frantic beat of her heart. She sat opposite the doctor, his calm demeanor a maddening foil to her internal tempest. The preliminary results lay on the table between them, a simple printout that held the potential to shatter her world anew. Inconsistencies, Dr. Thorne repeated, his voice smooth as polished granite. He pushed the paper closer. Specifically, regarding the paternal lineage of your child. Serafina's breath hitched. The carefully constructed wall of composure she'd erected began to crumble. She traced the stark black lines on the report, her finger trembling. What does that mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the lab. The scent of antiseptic and ozone filled her nostrils, a sharp, unwelcome reminder of the clinical detachment of the situation. "It means," Dr. Thorne said, his gaze unwavering, "that there's a significant probability that Julian is not the biological father." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Serafina felt a wave of nausea wash over her, the pristine white lab suddenly tilting, threatening to engulf her in a dizzying vortex of disbelief. She clutched the arms of the chair, her knuckles white. The luxurious fabrics and city lights of her life seemed a million miles away. All that remained was the stark reality, a cold, hard truth laid bare. The relief she'd anticipated, the vindication she'd craved, were replaced by a chilling emptiness, a void where certainty once stood. But how?" she stammered, her voice raw with pain and confusion. The carefully constructed narrative of betrayal and heartbreak, the very foundation of her anger and sorrow, crumbled like sandcastles under a relentless tide. Dr. Thorne leaned back, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. "That, Mrs. Moreau," he said, his voice low and measured, "is a question only further testing can answer, and perhaps," he added, his eyes glinting with something that resembled amusement, "some deeper investigation into your social circle." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The silence that followed was thick with tension, the unspoken accusations hanging between them like a shroud. Serafina stared at him, her mind racing, a cold dread creeping into her heart. This wasn't just about Julian. This was about her, about the life she had built, about the truth she hadn't yet begun to face. The penthouse felt colder now, devoid of the warmth Serafina had once believed it held. The city lights, usually a glittering backdrop to her life, now seemed distant and cold, mirroring the icy chasm that had opened between her and Julian. She traced the rim of a half-empty glass of wine, the chill seeping into her fingertips, a physical manifestation of the emotional freeze gripping her. Days bled into nights, each sunrise a cruel reminder of the uncertainty consuming her. The preliminary results, a cryptic message from a hidden universe, haunted her waking hours. Doubt, a seed initially planted by suspicion, had grown into a thorny vine, twisting around her heart. She found herself seeking solace in the company of Isabella, a lifelong friend whose unwavering loyalty offered a fragile anchor in the storm. Isabella, pragmatic and perceptive, listened without judgment as Serafina poured out her conflicted emotions, the raw ache of betrayal, the flicker of hope, the terrifying possibility of a life completely rewritten. The scent of Isabella's lavender perfume, usually comforting, now only served to highlight the stark artificiality of her own meticulously crafted existence. "It's not just about Julian anymore, is it?" Isabella said, her voice soft, her hand covering Serafina's. The warmth of her touch was a lifeline in the freezing expanse of Serafina's despair. The clinking of ice in glasses, a low murmur of conversation from the other room, felt distant, almost unreal. "No," Serafina admitted, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It's about everything. About who I am, what I believe, what I've built. All of it, crumbling." The weight of her confession pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket of self-doubt. The following days brought a series of tense meetings with Dr. Thorne. His enigmatic smile remained a constant irritant, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Serafina's emotional turmoil. Each session was a slow drip of information, the doctor carefully measuring his words, adding layers of ambiguity to an already confusing situation. The antiseptic smell of his laboratory, the sterile gleam of chrome equipment, became synonymous with the chilling uncertainty gripping her. Each carefully chosen word from the doctor felt like a calculated blow, pushing her closer to the brink of a devastating truth. The final appointment, scheduled for the following week, loomed like a guillotine. The sterile white of Dr. Thorne's laboratory felt oppressive. Serafina sat rigidly, the scent of antiseptic clinging to the air like a shroud. The results lay before her, a single sheet of paper, crisp and unforgiving. Thorne's voice, smooth as polished marble, broke the silence. "The DNA evidence is conclusive, Mrs. Moreau. Julian is not the father of your child." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold, shattering the carefully constructed facade of Serafina's grief. Relief, unexpected and overwhelming, washed over her, a tidal wave threatening to drown the lingering bitterness. But beneath the relief, a chilling emptiness settled, a vast unknown yawning before her. The betrayal she'd felt, the rage, it was all misplaced? Who is the father then?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the laboratory equipment. Her hands trembled as she reached for the glass of water Thorne had offered, the cool liquid a fleeting comfort. Thorne's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "That, Mrs. Moreau, is a question that requires further investigation. The results only confirm the biological impossibility of Julian's paternity. The identity of the father remains a mystery, for now." He leaned back, his gaze appraising, almost predatory. The drive home blurred. The city lights, once symbols of her success, now felt mocking, highlighting the hollowness of her carefully constructed life. Isabella's presence, a comforting warmth amidst the chaos, offered solace. But even her unwavering support couldn't entirely soothe the turmoil within. The revelation hadn't brought peace. It had unleashed a storm of new uncertainties. The comfortable certainty of her world had been cruelly snatched away, replaced with a terrifying void. "It's like someone stole a piece of me," she confessed, her voice barely a breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Isabella's hand squeezed hers, a silent promise of unwavering support in the face of this devastating revelation. The betrayal she'd felt towards Julian was now replaced by a more profound sense of violation, a feeling of being utterly deceived. But by whom? And why? The questions hung heavy in the air, as heavy as the weight of the secret that now lay exposed. A secret far more complex and potentially dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The night stretched before her, an endless expanse of uncertainty, and the seed of a new mystery had been sown, far more chilling than the initial scandal. The penthouse suite, usually a haven of calm sophistication, felt suffocating. Serafina stared out at the glittering cityscape, the distant hum of traffic a dull roar against the frantic drumming of her heart. The news had sunk in, leaving behind a residue of numb disbelief. Julian wasn't the father. The relief was a phantom limb, a ghost of an emotion that felt both foreign and intensely necessary. Isabella, her best friend, sat beside her, a comforting presence in the swirling chaos. The clinking of ice in Isabella's crystal glass was the only sound besides Serafina's ragged breathing. "I feel violated," Serafina finally whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The champagne, untouched, sat beside her, a mocking symbol of the celebrations that had once defined her life. Isabella's hand covered Serafina's, her touch warm and steady. I know, darling. It's not just the betrayal, it's the sheer manipulation. Someone deliberately misled you. But who? Serafina's voice cracked. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. The polished mahogany table, usually a stage for elegant gatherings, felt like a judge's bench, weighing her down with its silent judgment. A sudden chill snaked through the room as the memory of Dr. Thorne's enigmatic smile pierced her thoughts. His eyes, she realized now, hadn't held the detached professionalism he'd projected. There'd been something else, a glint of calculation, a predatory gleam beneath the surface. We need to find out, Isabella said firmly, her voice strong and reassuring. We start with Thorne. He knew more than he let on. The city lights, once symbols of success and glamour, now seemed to mock Serafina's vulnerability. But a flicker of resolve ignited within her, a tiny spark amidst the darkness. The betrayal, the confusion, the anger, it wouldn't consume her. She would unravel this mystery, uncover the truth, and claim back control of her life. The fight, she realized, had just begun. The weight of the unknown remained, but it was lighter now, balanced by a newfound resolve that promised a journey into the terrifying, exhilarating unknown. The sterile white of the laboratory felt like a stark contrast to the opulent chaos of Serafina's life. Dr. Thorne, impeccably dressed despite the late hour, handed her the comprehensive report, the crisp paper a fragile barrier between them and a truth that threatened to shatter everything. The air hung heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and the scent of antiseptic. Serafina's hands, usually graceful and expressive, trembled as she took the document. The results are conclusive, Dr. Thorne stated, his voice a low hum, devoid of emotion. Julian is not the biological father of your child. The words, stark and clinical, landed with the impact of a physical blow. Relief, a sharp, unexpected pang, pierced the numbness. But it was quickly swallowed by a wave of something else. A profound sense of violation. A chilling realization of how completely she'd been manipulated. The champagne flutes, the lavish parties, the public spectacle of her heartbreak. All a carefully orchestrated performance. Who is the father then? She choked on the words, her voice barely a whisper above the hum of the laboratory equipment. Dr. Thorne's lips curved into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. That, Mrs. Moreau, he said, his eyes glittering with a disturbing intensity, is a question that will take some unraveling. The drive back to her penthouse was a blur. The city lights, usually so captivating, were now just a hazy smear through her tear-filled eyes. Isabella, her steadfast friend, sat beside her, her silence a comforting presence in the storm raging within. He knew, Serafina murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. He knew all along and said nothing. Isabella squeezed her hand, her touch conveying more understanding than any words could. We'll find out who, she said, her voice firm, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. We'll uncover every lie, every deception. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary, felt like a prison. The city's glittering expanse, once a symbol of success and glamour, mocked Serafina's pain. Yet, amidst the devastation, a seed of defiance took root. The anger, the hurt, the profound sense of betrayal, they would fuel her quest for the truth. The fight was far from over. The discovery of Julian's innocence was merely the first step in a much longer, more treacherous journey. The unveiling of the true deception had only just begun. The champagne flutes, once symbols of celebration, now felt like shards of glass in Serafina's memory. The penthouse, usually a haven of luxury, was suffocating. Isabella's presence, a quiet anchor in the storm, was a small comfort. The weight of the revelation, Julian's innocence, settled heavily. Relief warred with a bitter taste of violation. It's not just about Julian anymore, Serafina whispered, her voice trembling. The soft glow of the city lights outside seemed to mock her shattered world. Isabella nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. No, it's about finding out who betrayed you, Serafina. Who used you? The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. The scent of lilies, usually so calming, now felt cloying, a reminder of the opulent facade that had masked the truth. Serafina ran a hand through her hair, the silk catching on a tear. I feel violated, she confessed, her voice raw with emotion. Used as a pawn in some twisted game. Isabella squeezed her hand. We'll find out who's playing the game, and we'll make them pay. Her voice held a steely resolve, a stark contrast to Serafina's fragile despair. The cool night air from the open balcony offered a momentary respite, a brief break from the stifling weight of the revelation. But who? Serafina's voice was barely audible, lost in the vastness of the city. The image of Dr. Thorne's enigmatic smile flashed in her mind, a chilling premonition. He knew all along. A fresh wave of anger, potent and raw, surged through her, pushing back the despair. This wasn't just about finding the biological father. It was about exposing a web of deceit that had ensnared her. The fight for justice, for her own dignity, had just begun. The city lights, once symbols of her success, now seemed to gleam with the promise of retribution. The news spread like wildfire, igniting a maelstrom of reactions. Julian, pale and drawn, stared at the stark white paper, the genetic results a cruel mockery of his carefully constructed life. Relief warred with a profound sense of violation. He hadn't been the betrayer, but he'd been lied to, manipulated. The weight of the public scorn, now partially lifted, was replaced by a heavier burden, the truth of his own unwitting complicity. Serafina, meanwhile, found herself in a strange limbo. The initial euphoria of exoneration had faded, leaving behind a hollow ache. The champagne she sipped tasted like ash. The penthouse, once a symbol of success, now felt like a gilded cage. Isabella, her loyal friend, sat beside her, a silent presence offering comfort. I feel empty, Serafina confessed, her voice barely a whisper, lost in the vast expanse of the room. Relieved yet violated. It's like a part of me is missing. The journalist, Mark, paced his small, cluttered office, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked window. The revelation had thrown his meticulously crafted narrative into chaos. Ethical dilemmas gnawed at him. He had fueled the fire of public outrage, and now the truth felt like a betrayal of his own journalistic integrity. The phone rang, shattering the silence. It was a source, offering a cryptic clue. Look into the Nightingale Gallery, and the benefactor. The chilling words hung in the air, a new direction for his investigation. A sense of urgency filled him. He had to find out who orchestrated this elaborate deception, this cruel game of genetic manipulation. The city, a relentless backdrop to the unfolding drama, pulsed with a newfound mystery, a darker, more sinister layer now revealed. The scent of rain and the distant sirens only amplified the unease. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Mark as he began to unravel a web far larger than he had ever imagined. The fight for truth, his truth, was about to begin, and the stakes were higher than ever before. The penthouse suite, usually a beacon of glittering luxury, felt suffocating. Serafina stared at the city lights, a million pinpricks of cold indifference mirroring the hollowness in her chest. The champagne, as Isabella had predicted, tasted like ash. Empty? She repeated, the word catching in her throat. Isabella's hand, warm and comforting, rested on hers. The silence between them hummed with unspoken anxieties. It's not just the baby, is it? Isabella finally said, her voice soft, understanding. The unspoken question hung in the air. The betrayal, the shattered trust, the loss of the life they both knew. Serafina shook her head, tears welling. No, it's everything. The years, the lies. I built my life on a foundation of sand. The crystal glass slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the polished marble floor. the sound oddly mirroring the fragmentation of her world. Julian entered, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond the sleepless nights. He looked smaller, somehow shrunken by the weight of the revelation. He didn't approach, remaining by the doorway, a silent observer of their grief. The chasm between them felt vast, insurmountable. He began, his voice rough, choked with emotion. He stopped, unable to find the words to bridge the distance. The guilt in his eyes was palpable, a silent apology for a lifetime of unspoken truths. The phone buzzed, jarring them from their silent agony. Isabella answered, her face hardening as she listened. "It's Mark," she said, handing the phone to Serafina. "He says he needs to talk about the Nightingale Gallery." The name hung in the air, a cryptic whisper in the vast, echoing silence of their shattered world. The sense of unease, amplified by the city's relentless pulse, gnawed at them. The relief of the genetic revelation had been short-lived, replaced by a deeper, more unsettling mystery. The game, it seemed, was far from over. The penthouse felt colder now, the champagne's fizz replaced by a chilling silence. Serafina's gaze, usually sharp and vibrant, was dulled, reflecting the city lights like shattered glass. The news Julian wasn't the father hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Relief warred with a deep, unsettling violation. It wasn't the simple joy of exoneration. It was the chilling realization that her entire life, her marriage, had been built on a lie she hadn't even known existed. "The Nightingale Gallery," she whispered, the name a bitter echo in the opulent space. Mark's message, a cryptic plea for a meeting, felt like a threat. Isabella's hand tightened on hers, a silent reassurance against the encroaching panic. Julian watched them, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the revelation etched on his weary face. He'd hoped for forgiveness, for a chance to rebuild, but the truth had cracked their world open, revealing a deeper chasm than infidelity. The genetic results had offered a reprieve, but the new mystery felt like a darker, more sinister betrayal. "It's different now," he finally said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of the bravado he'd once possessed. The words were inadequate, a feeble attempt to bridge the chasm. Serafina looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time since the scandal broke. She saw the pain, the exhaustion, the fear mirroring her own. The anger, the burning resentment, had begun to recede, leaving a void filled with a confusing mix of sadness and something akin to pity. "Different?" she echoed, the word tasting like ash on her tongue. "Everything is different." The city's relentless pulse hammered against the panoramic windows, a discordant rhythm to the quiet turmoil within the penthouse. The relief was fleeting, overshadowed by a chilling uncertainty. The answers they sought might lie not in a medical report, but in the shadows of a gallery named the Nightingale, a name that whispered secrets into the night. Their journey, it seemed, had just begun. The revelation hung between them, a tangible thing, thicker than the expensive champagne Isabella had poured, untouched, in crystal flutes. Sunlight, harsh and unforgiving, sliced through the penthouse windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the opulent space. Serafina felt the chill despite the summer heat, a tremor of icy dread replacing the earlier shock. Julian, usually so composed, looked broken. I didn't know," he whispered, his voice raw with a pain that mirrored her own. The words, though simple, carried the weight of a lifetime of unspoken truths. Isabella, Serafina's closest friend, watched them both, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. She'd suspected something was amiss, but the brutal reality was far more devastating than anything she'd imagined. She reached out, her hand covering Serafina's, a silent offering of comfort in the face of such shattering news. The journalist, Daniel, arrived shortly after, his presence a stark contrast to the quiet turmoil within the penthouse. His keen eyes, usually alight with journalistic ambition, were clouded with a mixture of professional curiosity and genuine concern. He'd been chasing the story of Julian and Serafina's spectacular fall from grace, but the truth, as it unveiled itself, was far more complex, far more human. "This changes everything," he stated, his voice a low murmur as he took in the scene. The carefully constructed narrative he'd been building crumbled before his eyes. He saw the raw emotion etched on Serafina's face, the stark vulnerability replacing her usual composed demeanor. He saw Julian's despair, a stark contrast to the arrogant architect he'd once portrayed in his articles. Serafina looked at Daniel, her voice barely a whisper. "It does, doesn't it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The relief was a fleeting shadow, replaced by a deep, gnawing uncertainty. The paternity issue was resolved, but the lie, the deception, ran far deeper. The Nightingale Gallery, Mark's cryptic message. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but a horrifying pattern was starting to emerge. The weight of the unanswered questions pressed down on her, heavier than the public scrutiny, heavier than the pain of betrayal. This was a violation of a different kind, a violation of trust, of identity. The luxury penthouse, once a symbol of their perfect life, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping them in a web of deceit far more intricate than a simple affair. The journey to uncover the truth had just begun, and the destination remained shrouded in mystery, promising a confrontation far more challenging than any courtroom drama. The Nightingale Gallery. The name echoed in Serafina's mind, a chilling counterpoint to the opulent silence of the penthouse. Sunlight glinted off the polished marble floor, mocking the turmoil within her. Julian sat slumped in an armchair, the lines of his face etched with a weariness that went beyond the recent scandal. Isabella, ever practical, was on the phone, her voice low and urgent. Daniel, the journalist, paced restlessly, his usual sharp eyes clouded with a grim determination. "It's not just about the baby, is it?" Serafina's voice, though barely above a whisper, cut through the tense atmosphere. The relief of knowing Julian wasn't the father was fleeting, replaced by a cold dread. The Nightingale Gallery, Mark's cryptic message hinting at a connection far deeper than a simple indiscretion. Julian nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the champagne flutes, untouched, a testament to the shattered celebration. Mark, he was a friend from art school. He was involved with something dangerous. His voice trailed off, choked with unspoken fears. The weight of his secret, kept for years, now threatened to crush him. Daniel, ever the hawk, seized on the opening. Dangerous? What kind of dangerous? His notepad was already open, his pen poised, ready to capture every detail. The thirst for the story warred with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't the simple betrayal he'd initially anticipated. This was something far bigger, far more insidious. Isabella hung up the phone, her face grim. "I've spoken to a few of Serafina's former associates. There are whispers, suggestions of a clandestine network, linked to the gallery." She looked at Serafina, her eyes filled with concern. "People are afraid, Serafina, afraid of what they might uncover." The air crackled with unspoken accusations. The initial shock of the paternity test had given way to a deeper, more unsettling mystery. The quest for the biological father was no longer a simple matter of finding a name. It was a descent into a world of shadows, where secrets and lies had taken root. The opulent penthouse, a symbol of their once perfect world, now felt like a pressure cooker, filled with simmering suspicions and unanswered questions. The truth, it seemed, was far more elusive and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The mahogany table gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room. Serafina traced the grain with a trembling finger, the polished surface a stark contrast to the rough texture of her anxiety. Across from her, Detective Inspector Davies, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with weariness, steepled his fingers. The air hung heavy with unspoken accusations. "The Nightingale Gallery," he repeated, his voice a low rumble. "We've uncovered some interesting connections. Money laundering primarily, and a network of associates, shall we say, who aren't always forthcoming." Serafina swallowed, the lump in her throat a physical manifestation of her fear. The gallery, once a symbol of Mark's vibrant talent, now felt like a viper's nest. Mark, he was secretive, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the fluorescent lights, the memory of Mark's enigmatic smile, his eyes sparkling with a mischievous intelligence, felt like a betrayal. We have evidence suggesting he was involved in far more than just art, Davies said, his gaze unwavering, and that his connections extend far beyond the gallery's walls. We believe there's a much larger operation at play. A wave of nausea washed over Serafina. The relief of knowing Julian wasn't the father had been short-lived. This new revelation, this labyrinth of deceit, felt far more devastating. She thought of Julian, his face pale and drawn, the weight of his own secrets pressing down on him. Their shared pain, their mutual betrayal, suddenly felt insignificant compared to this looming darkness. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice stronger now, laced with a desperate resolve. The initial shock had given way to a fierce determination to understand, to uncover the truth, no matter how painful. Davies leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "We need your help, Serafina. You knew Mark better than anyone. His associates, his habits, anything you can remember, no matter how insignificant it might seem, could be crucial." The weight of responsibility pressed down on her. She was no longer just a victim of a scandalous affair, but a key player in a far larger game. The truth, it seemed, was a slippery thing, elusive and dangerous, waiting to be uncovered amidst the shadows of the Nightingale Gallery and the web of deceit it concealed. The scent of old paper and dust mingled with the metallic tang of fear, the interrogation room a chilling prelude to a battle she hadn't even known she was fighting. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air in Dr. Thorne's office, a stark contrast to the opulent penthouse Serafina had just left. Sunlight, fractured by the city's glass canyons, painted jagged lines across the polished floor. She sat, rigid, clutching a lukewarm cup of tea, its chamomile scent doing little to soothe her frayed nerves. The genetic results, stark and undeniable, had left her reeling. Julian wasn't the father. Relief warred with a profound sense of violation. Whose child was this, then? "The results are conclusive," Dr. Thorne said, his voice a smooth baritone, devoid of emotion. He watched her, his expression inscrutable, a disconcerting stillness in his dark eyes. "There's no doubt. The paternity is unexpected." Serafina met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. "Unexpected? That's an understatement. This changes everything." The words were a choked whisper, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. The scandal, the accusations, the public humiliation, all built on a lie. But what kind of lie? "Indeed," Thorne replied, his gaze unwavering. "The question now is, who is the father?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "My preliminary investigations suggest someone within your closest circle." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Serafina felt a chill crawl down her spine. Her closest circle, Mark, her vibrant, enigmatic ex-husband whose sudden death had been ruled an accident, yet whose life had been wrapped in secrecy. The Nightingale Gallery, a symbol of his success, now a dark cloud on the horizon. Or perhaps someone else. The thought sent a shiver through her. She trusted them all, and they'd betrayed her in the most profound way imaginable. The weight of her own vulnerability hit her hard, raw and shocking. "This is a nightmare," she breathed, her voice cracking. Tears threatened to spill over, but she blinked them back, her jaw clenching in a fierce determination. "I need to know. I have to know." Thorne's lips curved into a slight smile, revealing just a hint of something unsettling. "The search for the truth," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "is often more complicated than the truth itself." His words hung in the air, leaving Serafina with a growing sense of foreboding. The path to discovering the biological father, it seemed, was only just beginning, and it would lead her down a path far darker and far more treacherous than she could ever have imagined. The scent of old parchment and dust hung heavy in the air of Serafina's ancestral library. Sunlight, filtering through stained glass windows, cast kaleidoscopic patterns across the towering bookshelves. Debris, the possibility of a different kind of future flickered. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, a stark contrast to the opulent penthouse below. Serafina sat rigidly, her silk dress a jarring note against the clinical white of Dr. Thorne's office. The genetic report lay before her, a cold, factual summary of a life irrevocably altered. Julian, beside her, held her hand, his grip tight but gentle. His eyes, usually so full of life, held a haunted stillness. "So," Serafina began, her voice barely a whisper, "Isabella, she wasn't just a friend." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Julian nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "She was more than that. A secret I kept. A mistake. One that cost us everything." He squeezed her hand, a silent apology. A wave of nausea washed over Serafina. The revelation of Isabella's role was a bitter pill, compounding the initial shock of the paternity test. The betrayal cut deeper now, reaching beyond the initial infidelity to encompass a lifetime of carefully constructed lies. "But why?" she finally managed, her voice laced with anguish. "Why involve me? Why risk everything?" Julian's sigh was a heartbroken sound. "I panicked. The public scrutiny, the accusations, I couldn't face it. I hoped this would protect you." His explanation, though unconvincing, carried a thread of truth. The weight of his confession was palpable, a heavy cloak of remorse. Serafina saw the genuine pain etched on his face, the years of agonizing secrecy weighing heavily on him. Perhaps, she thought, amidst the devastation, there was a shared burden, a shared deception. The silence stretched, filled only with the hum of the air conditioning and the quiet thump of their hearts. The truth, brutal in its clarity, was a chasm between them, yet it also provided a shared foundation. The lies that had built their world were crumbling, but in the debris, a different kind of understanding began to grow. The road ahead was uncertain, scarred by betrayal and loss, but in the quiet understanding, a fragile hope flickered. A new beginning, not of reconciliation, perhaps, but of acceptance. The penthouse suite, usually a haven of shimmering luxury, felt suffocating. Sunlight, fractured by the cityscape, cast long shadows across the polished marble floor. Julian poured 2 glasses of water, his hands trembling slightly. The ice clinked, a fragile sound in the heavy silence. Serafina sat on the plush sofa, the silk of her dress rustling softly as she shifted. The air hung heavy with the unspoken. "I understand now," Serafina said, her voice low, almost a breath. "The genetic test, Isabella." The words were not an accusation, but a statement of bleak acceptance. The pain, raw and visceral, was palpable in the stillness of the room. Julian met her gaze, his own eyes mirroring her sorrow. It wasn't a deliberate deception. Not in the beginning. It started as a misguided attempt to protect you from something far worse. He paused, the words catching in his throat. The weight of years of carefully constructed lies pressed upon him. He saw the flicker of doubt in Serafina's eyes, a question forming on her lips. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. The unspoken plea for forgiveness hung between them, heavy as the city's smog. "There's another part of this," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "A part that involves Dr. Thorne." He swallowed, bracing himself for her reaction. The revelation of Thorne's involvement shifted the narrative once again, from a personal betrayal to a calculated web of deceit. A cold dread washed over Serafina. The initial shock of the paternity test now seemed insignificant compared to the looming shadow of a larger conspiracy. The seemingly simple affair, the public humiliation, were merely pieces in a larger, more sinister game. She felt a chilling sense of violation, a realization that their pain had been manipulated, exploited for purposes far beyond their comprehension. The image of Dr. Thorne, a man of science, of supposed integrity, now morphed into something darker, more calculating. He knew, she breathed, the pieces beginning to fall into place. He knew all along. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless and shaken. The sterile clinical environment of his office, the controlled precision of his movements, now felt sinister, a calculated manipulation. This new layer of deception raised the stakes exponentially, transforming their personal tragedy into something far more significant, more far-reaching. The quiet understanding, the fragile hope that had begun to bloom, withered under the weight of this new, shattering truth. The city thrummed below, a muted roar against the plush silence of the penthouse. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the tempest in Serafina's soul. The scent of lilies, usually a comfort, felt cloying, heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations. Julian sat opposite her, his silhouette stark against the cityscape, a man wrestling with his own ghosts. "He used us," Serafina whispered, her voice catching on a sob. The words hung in the air, a fragile accusation laced with disbelief. The genetic test had revealed a shocking truth, but this manipulation was a deeper wound. Julian's jaw tightened. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the gesture conveying a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. I didn't know the extent of it. I thought it was a simple case of misplaced trust, a professional rivalry, perhaps." His voice was low, rough with regret. Serafina looked away, her gaze fixed on the swirling rain. The image of Dr. Thorne's calm, professional facade, now twisted by the revelation of his deceit, burned in her mind. The cold precision of his lab, the sterile scent of antiseptic, now felt like a suffocating prison. "He orchestrated the entire thing," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "The leaked photos, the whispers, everything." A tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening track through the carefully applied makeup. "He knew I wouldn't believe Julian. He used my vulnerability, my anger." Julian reached across the space between them, his hand hesitant, unsure. He didn't touch her, but the gesture held the weight of unspoken apology, of shared pain. "We were both pawns," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "He used our vulnerabilities against us, feeding the flames of our conflict for his own gain." The rain intensified, the drumming on the glass a relentless soundtrack to their shared despair. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions, a heavy blanket woven from betrayal, grief, and the dawning realization of a far greater conspiracy than either of them had ever imagined. The truth, once revealed, had only deepened the mystery, leaving them adrift in a sea of uncertainty, clinging to the fragile hope of a shared vindication. The journalist's investigation, Julian knew, was now their only path towards the light. The penthouse hummed with a low thrum of controlled fury. Serafina paced, the plush carpet yielding silently beneath her heels. The city lights, a glittering tapestry below, offered no comfort. She stopped, clutching the crystal decanter, its coolness a stark contrast to the burning anger within. "He used my love for Julian," she whispered, more to herself than to the empty room. Julian watched her, a ghost of his former self. The weight of the revelation, the betrayal by Dr. Thorne, had etched lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He saw not the successful architect in the mirror, but a man stripped bare by deceit. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble. "And he used my desire for a child. He knew how much I wanted a family." The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken accusations and shared pain. The lilies, their fragrance once a symbol of their perfect life, now felt like a mocking reminder of the shattered illusion. Serafina finally turned, her gaze piercing. "It's not just about the child, Julian. It's about the lies, the manipulation. He destroyed everything." He nodded, a slow, painful movement. "He played us both, used our vulnerabilities to build his own empire of deceit. He's a predator, Serafina, and we were his prey." He ran a hand over his face, the gesture weary, defeated. The truth felt like a cruel joke, a twist of fate that had stripped them bare. The rain outside intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm against the glass, mirroring the storm raging within them both. A wave of nausea washed over Serafina. The betrayal was a wound that ran deeper than the infidelity. The violation of her trust, the manipulation of her emotions, was a poison coursing through her veins. She sank onto the plush sofa, the softness offering little solace. The weight of the revelation pressed down, heavy and suffocating. Julian sat beside her, the distance between them shrinking. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the unspoken understanding hung between them, fragile yet potent. The shattered pieces of their lives lay scattered around them, waiting to be pieced together, or perhaps simply accepted as irreparable fragments of a past that could never be rewritten. The journalist's investigation, the legal battles to come, those were secondary now. Their first task was to navigate the treacherous terrain of their own broken hearts. The path ahead remained uncertain, shrouded in the shadows of deceit and the lingering taste of betrayal, yet a shared understanding, a fragile hope, flickered between them, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable loss. The journalist, Elias Thorne, no relation to Dr. Eris Thorne, a fact that added a layer of unsettling coincidence, sat hunched over his laptop, the glow illuminating his tired face. Empty coffee cups and crumpled papers littered his desk, a battlefield of research. He'd pieced together fragments of Dr. Thorne's shady dealings, a web of falsified results and manipulated genetic data, extending far beyond Serafina and Julian's case. The chilling realization hit him. This wasn't just about one couple. This was a systemic corruption. He reread Serafina's statement, her words echoing the raw pain of betrayal. The rain lashed against his window, a relentless counterpoint to the frantic tapping of his fingers. He needed a way in, a concrete piece of evidence to expose Dr. Thorne's empire of deceit. A sudden chill ran down his spine as a detail from Serafina's initial interview resurfaced, a mention of a coded message, hidden within a seemingly innocuous email exchange between Dr. Thorne and a shadowy associate. Elias's heart pounded. This could be the key. Meanwhile, in Julian's secluded study, the scent of old books and pipe tobacco hung heavy in the air. He stared at a framed photograph of Serafina and their child, a bittersweet ache in his chest. The initial relief of the truth had given way to a profound sadness. He'd lost Serafina, not to another man, but to a web of lies spun by a ruthless geneticist. The guilt gnawed at him. He'd been so consumed by his own pain, his own shattered image, that he'd failed to see the deeper deception unfolding. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the burning shame within. He needed to talk to Serafina, to offer not just apology but understanding. The weight of his silence, his initial inability to process the truth, weighed heavily on his conscience. The call connected. The line crackled with static, mirroring the fractured state of their relationship. He heard her voice, soft but laced with a quiet strength he hadn't noticed before. A fragile hope sparked within him, a chance for reconciliation, not as lovers, perhaps, but as people who had been victims of the same cruel game. The rain outside continued its relentless assault, a testament to the storm that had ravaged their lives. But within the quiet understanding growing between them, a faint glimmer of sunrise promised to break through. The dimly lit office hummed with the low thrum of Elias's laptop. Rain hammered against the window panes, a relentless percussion accompanying the frantic rhythm of his typing. He scrolled through the decoded email, the cryptic message now laid bare. A series of seemingly random numbers, but a pattern emerged, coordinates. A surge of adrenaline shot through him. This wasn't just corruption. This was a deliberate, calculated plan. He traced the coordinates on a map, his breath catching in his throat. A private clinic, nestled in the Swiss Alps, far from prying eyes. The phone rang, jarring him from his reverie. It was Serafina. Her voice, usually vibrant, was subdued, tinged with weariness. "Elias," she whispered. I need to talk." He listened, his pen poised over his notepad. She spoke of a recurring dream, a hazy memory of a clandestine meeting, a whispered conversation in a shadowy alley, a fleeting image of a man, his face obscured, but the glint of a distinctive ring on his finger. The same ring Dr. Thorne had been seen wearing in a grainy photograph Elias had unearthed. The pieces were falling into place, a horrifying mosaic of deceit and manipulation. "This clinic, it's where they did the initial genetic testing," Serafina said, her voice barely audible, laced with a profound sense of betrayal. "Dr. Thorne, he wasn't just negligent. He orchestrated this." Elias felt a chill crawl down his spine. The enormity of the conspiracy, the sheer scale of Dr. Thorne's deception, threatened to overwhelm him. Yet, within this chilling revelation, a flicker of hope ignited. He had the key. He had the evidence to expose not just a rogue geneticist, but a systemic corruption that had shattered lives and twisted the very fabric of truth. The rain outside had eased, leaving behind a hushed stillness, but the tempest within him raged on, fueled by a righteous fury and the unwavering determination to bring Dr. Thorne's reign of deceit to an end. The story wasn't just about a scandalous affair. It was a fight for justice, a quest to restore truth in a world shrouded in lies. The penthouse suite, usually a beacon of glittering luxury, felt cold and sterile. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the storm raging inside Serafina. Across the room, Dr. Thorne sat impeccably dressed, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a tight-lipped stillness. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. "You knew," Serafina breathed, her voice barely a whisper above the drumming rain. Her eyes, usually sparkling with life, were shadowed with a deep, chilling weariness. The scent of expensive perfume couldn't mask the tremor in her hands. Thorne steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering. "Knew what, Mrs. Moreau?" His voice, smooth as polished marble, held a chilling detachment. "The truth," she choked out, the word catching in her throat. "About the paternity test. You manipulated the results." He didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "It wasn't manipulation, Serafina. It was corrective action. Your life, your reputation. It was all on the line. A little white lie to save you from utter ruin." Serafina recoiled as if struck. "A little white lie? You destroyed my marriage, my trust, my very sense of self. For what? To protect me?" Hot tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain-streaked glass. He sighed, a weary sound that betrayed the carefully constructed facade. "The man you believed to be the father, he wasn't a suitable match. I saw what the truth would do to you, to Julian. The scandal would be unbearable. So you chose to lie?" she whispered, her voice raw with pain. The scent of lilies from a nearby vase suddenly felt cloying, suffocating. "I chose to protect you," he insisted, his voice hardening. He rose, moving towards her, his silhouette stark against the stormy backdrop. "And I believe I did." Serafina laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the vast apartment. "Protect me? By tearing my world apart? By twisting the truth into a grotesque parody of reality?" She stood, her body trembling with barely controlled rage. "You are a monster, Dr. Thorne. A monster disguised as a savior." Her gaze burned into him, a searing intensity that finally broke through his carefully constructed calm. He flinched, a crack in his armor. The storm outside seemed to intensify, mimicking the tempest brewing between them, a tempest that promised a far more devastating revelation. The mahogany table between them felt cold, a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from the expensive Persian rug beneath Serafina's bare feet. Dr. Thorne, his face pale under the harsh glare of the penthouse chandelier, pushed a crystal decanter towards her. "Cognac?" he offered, his voice a thin veneer over the tremor she sensed beneath. Serafina refused with a shake of her head, the gesture sharp and precise. The scent of rain, mingled with the cloying sweetness of lilies, clung to the air, a suffocating perfume of deception. "No," she said, her voice low and husky. "I don't need a drink to feel the burn." He remained seated, the expensive suit doing little to disguise the rigid posture that betrayed his unease. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the panoramic windows. Outside, the city lights blurred into a shimmering, indistinct tapestry. Inside, the truth lay bare and brutal. It wasn't just about protecting Serafina, he finally admitted, his voice a pained whisper. It was about ambition. The research, it was groundbreaking, but funding was dwindling. Your case? It was the perfect opportunity to secure further investment. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Serafina stared at him, a chilling calm settling over her features. The earlier rage had curdled into a cold, bitter disappointment. So my life, my marriage, was merely a pawn in your elaborate game? She asked, her voice laced with icy disdain. The tremor in her hands was now palpable. He flinched, avoiding her gaze. It wasn't like that, he protested, his voice pleading. The results? They were altered, yes, but the underlying truth, it still holds. The father. He trailed off, unable to meet her eyes. Serafina rose, her movements graceful, yet imbued with a newfound strength. She walked to the window, the cool glass a welcome contrast to the heat rising within her. The rain-slicked city below pulsed with a life she had been so brutally separated from. The truth, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper, is that you are a predator, Dr. Thorne. You preyed on vulnerability, using deceit as your weapon. She turned, her eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. And I won't let you get away with it. The storm raging within her mirrored the tempestuous night outside, promising a reckoning that would leave no stone unturned. The game, it seemed, was far from over. The penthouse suite, usually a sanctuary of opulent calm, felt claustrophobic. The scent of lilies, previously a comforting presence, now clung to the air like a shroud. Serafina, her face pale but resolute, watched as Dr. Thorne meticulously cleaned a stray drop of cognac from the polished mahogany table. The act, so precise and deliberate, felt almost mocking in its meticulousness. So, she began, her voice low, each word carrying the weight of unspoken accusations. The investment was more important than the truth? Thorne flinched, his gaze darting to the panoramic windows showcasing the rain-lashed city. It wasn't a simple choice, he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper lost in the drumming rhythm of the rain. The research, it was revolutionary. The funding, it was essential. And my life, Serafina's voice sharpened, a brittle edge slicing through his carefully constructed defense. My marriage, my child, mere collateral damage in your pursuit of scientific glory. Her hand trembled, but she refused to let it show. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and something else, a desperate plea for understanding. Serafina, I never intended. Intended what? She interrupted, her voice rising in a quiet, controlled fury. To shatter a family? To destroy a life built on a lie? To manipulate the very fabric of my reality? The chill in her voice was sharper than the icy rain lashing against the glass. He didn't answer, the silence stretching taut between them, charged with unspoken accusations and the bitter taste of betrayal. The expensive Persian rug, usually a symbol of luxury, felt like a suffocating carpet beneath her feet. The weight of his deception pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating, as if the very air in the room had turned toxic. Serafina moved to the window, her back to him. The city lights blurred, a chaotic jumble of light and shadow mirroring the turmoil within her. The rain, a relentless torrent, seemed to mimic the ceaseless flow of her anger. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. A long moment passed, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain and the city's hushed murmurs below. Then, she turned, her expression unreadable. "Tell me about the other women," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. The words hung in the air, a stark challenge, a final, devastating blow. The game, she knew, was far from over. This was merely the beginning of the reckoning. The opulent penthouse, usually a beacon of warmth, felt chillingly empty. The scent of lilies, once comforting, now hung heavy, cloying. Serafina's gaze, sharp and unforgiving, locked onto Dr. Thorne. He fidgeted, his expensive suit doing little to mask his discomfort. The rain hammered against the panoramic windows, a relentless percussion mirroring the tempest in her soul. "The other women?" she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The question hung between them, thick with unspoken accusations. Thorne shifted, his eyes darting away from hers. "There were complications," he stammered, his voice a thin thread against the roar of the storm. "The research required certain sacrifices." Sacrifices. Serafina's voice was low, dangerously calm. She crossed her arms, the silk of her robe rustling against her skin, a stark contrast to the turmoil within. "My life was a sacrifice? My marriage, a mere experiment?" The quiet fury in her voice was a tangible thing, palpable in the suddenly frigid air. Thorne's gaze flickered to the half-empty glass of cognac, the amber liquid reflecting the storm raging outside and, perhaps, the storm within him. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, the words catching in his throat. He was a man used to control, to manipulating facts and figures, but Serafina's raw grief, her unyielding anger, were forces beyond his comprehension. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass was a relentless soundtrack to the unspoken accusations. Serafina, her back rigid, felt a bone-deep weariness settle over her. The betrayal, the deception, had chipped away at her, leaving her hollowed out, a shell of the woman she once was. Yet, in the eye of the storm, a flicker of resolve ignited. She moved towards him, her steps deliberate, each footfall echoing in the vast space. She stopped inches from him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity that chilled him to the bone, boring into his. "You thought you could control everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "You manipulated the science, manipulated the results, manipulated lives. But you underestimated one thing, Dr. Thorne, the strength of a woman determined to uncover the truth." The finality in her voice was a declaration, a promise. The rain continued its relentless assault, but now it felt less like a relentless torment and more like a cleansing wash, carrying away the lies and deception, leaving behind the raw, brutal truth. The game was far from over, but for the first time, Serafina felt a shift in the balance of power. The reckoning had begun. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of hushed whispers and rustling papers. Dr. Eris Thorne, his usually impeccable composure shattered, sat hunched, the sharp lines of his expensive suit somehow emphasizing his defeat. The judge's gavel, a final, resounding crack, echoed the shattering of his carefully constructed world. Guilty on all counts. The verdict hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the humidity clinging to the city outside. Serafina watched from the gallery, the weight of the past months finally lifting. The victory felt hollow, however, a stark relief, not jubilation. The truth, brutally exposed, had left scars on her soul. The mahogany of the courtroom seemed to absorb the lingering tension, leaving only a silence filled with the aftermath of a devastating storm. She saw Julian in the crowd below, a shadow of his former self, yet a shadow infused with a newly acquired strength. Their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them, a fragile bridge rebuilt across the chasm of betrayal and misunderstanding. Later, in a quiet corner of the city's oldest park, surrounded by the ancient, whispering oaks, they sat together. The afternoon sun, filtering through the leaves, dappled the ground in shifting patterns of light and shade, mirroring the complexities of their emotions. The air hummed with the distant sounds of the city, a counterpoint to the quiet peace they found in each other's company. "I never wanted to believe it," Julian began, his voice rough with unshed tears. "The photos, the accusations, felt like a nightmare." Serafina nodded, her own voice choked with emotion. The truth was a nightmare too, in its own way. Finding out about everything, it shattered my world. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining, a silent testament to their shared pain and burgeoning understanding. The touch was fragile, tentative, a cautious exploration of a new path. He manipulated us both, Julian continued, his gaze distant, used our pain, our vulnerabilities, for his own twisted game. The setting sun painted the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking spectacle that seemed to reflect the rebirth of hope slowly dawning in their hearts. They sat in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the city a distant murmur against the backdrop of their shared history, their wounds, their quiet reconciliation. The journey ahead was long and uncertain, yet for the first time in a long time, they felt a shared sense of peace, an understanding that extended beyond the wreckage of their broken marriage, a promise of a future defined by truth, not deception. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Serafina's clothes, a lingering ghost of the courtroom. Outside, the city thrummed, a chaotic symphony of car horns and distant sirens, a stark contrast to the quiet turmoil within her. She stood on the balcony of her penthouse, the city lights twinkling like fallen stars below. The champagne Julian had sent earlier sat untouched, a mocking symbol of their shattered celebration. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, mirroring the shimmering city lights. It wasn't just the victory over Thorn. It was the crushing weight of the truth, the revelation of a life she hadn't known. Her son, the boy who was the center of her universe, wasn't Julian's. A soft knock echoed on the door. Julian stood there, his eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were shadowed with weariness. He held a single, bruised purple orchid. I saw them selling these near the park, he mumbled, offering it to her. The gesture, simple yet profound, spoke volumes. Serafina accepted the flower, the delicate petals cool against her skin. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words, shared pain, and the fragile hope of a future they hadn't anticipated. The city lights blurred through her tears, a kaleidoscope of emotions swirling within her. Forgiveness wasn't a simple switch to flip. It was a long, arduous journey. Yet, in Julian's weary eyes, in the quiet offering of a bruised orchid, she saw a glimmer of that path, a shared journey towards something new, something real. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and distant jasmine. The city lights pulsed, a rhythmic heartbeat against the night. Serafina took a deep breath, the cool night air a balm to her aching soul. She turned, a hesitant smile touching her lips, and looked at Julian. Let's start again," she said, her voice barely a breath, a whisper carried on the city's restless wind. The future remained uncertain, a canvas yet to be painted, but for the first time in months, the possibilities no longer felt terrifying. They felt hopeful. The courtroom's sterile scent clung to Serafina like a shroud. Outside, the city roared, a cacophony mirroring the turmoil within her. She stood on her penthouse balcony, the city lights a glittering, indifferent ocean below. The legal victory over Dr. Thorne felt hollow. The champagne Julian had sent remained untouched, a bitter testament to their shattered life. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, reflecting the city's cold brilliance. It wasn't just the win. It was the crushing weight of the truth, the brutal revelation of a life she'd never known. Her son, her precious son, wasn't Julian's. A soft knock. Julian stood in the doorway, his usually mischievous eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He held a single, bruised purple orchid. I saw them near the park," he mumbled, offering it. The gesture, simple yet profound, resonated deeply. Serafina accepted the flower, its cool petals a stark contrast to the burning heat in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. Silence hung heavy, thick with unspoken pain, shared loss, and the fragile tendrils of a future neither had anticipated. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and distant jasmine, a fragile perfume against the city's harshness. Serafina drew a deep breath, the cool night air a balm to her wounded soul. She turned, a hesitant smile touching her lips, and looked at Julian. Let's start again," she said, her voice a breath, carried on the city's restless wind. The future remained unwritten, a blank canvas, but for the first time in months, the possibilities didn't feel terrifying. They felt possible. The city lights pulsed, a steady heartbeat against the night, a rhythm echoing the tentative beat of their renewed hope. The orchid, bruised and imperfect, mirrored their own fractured selves, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the enduring power of forgiveness. The courtroom's echoing silence finally broke, replaced by the murmur of the dismissed jury. Dr. Thorne, his face a mask of controlled fury, was led away, the click of handcuffs a stark counterpoint to the rustling of papers and hushed whispers. The weight of his actions, the shattered lives, the manipulated truths, hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Serafina felt it press down on her, a physical burden. Outside, the city throbbed, a relentless pulse against the quietude of the courtroom. Julian found her on the penthouse balcony, the wind whipping at her hair, the city lights a blurry, indifferent backdrop. He didn't speak, simply handed her a steaming mug. The warmth of the chamomile tea seeped into her chilled fingers, a small comfort in the vast emptiness. "They're saying terrible things," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the wind. The media frenzy had already begun, a tidal wave of accusations and speculation. She felt exposed, raw. Julian sat beside her, the silence between them filled only by the city's distant hum. He reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch hesitant but reassuring. "They'll forget," he said softly, his voice rough with unshed tears. "It's the truth that matters now." His words, simple yet profound, brought a fresh wave of emotion. Relief washed over her, then a profound sadness. The victory felt hollow, a Pyrrhic win at best. The scandal had irrevocably altered their lives. Yet, in his hand, in his quiet strength, she saw a glimmer of hope. The hope of rebuilding, not necessarily what they once had, but something new, something stronger, forged in the crucible of pain and betrayal. "The orchid," she began, her voice catching, the bruised purple flower, a symbol of their shared journey through pain, sat on the small table between them, a testament to their resilience. He nodded, his eyes mirroring her own complex emotions. "A reminder," he said quietly, "that even the most damaged things can still hold beauty." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain, a promise of cleansing, of renewal. The city lights, once a symbol of their shattered world, now seemed to shimmer with a new, fragile light. The future remained uncertain, yet for the first time in a long time, Serafina felt a flicker of peace. They had survived. They would rebuild. Together. The journey would be long and arduous, but they would face it, together, hand in hand. The penthouse suite, usually a beacon of opulence, felt sterile. Sunlight, fractured by the rain-streaked windows, cast long shadows across the minimalist furniture. Serafina traced the rim of her empty teacup, the fine china cold against her fingertips. The taste of chamomile lingered, a bitter aftertaste mirroring the lingering bitterness in her heart. Julian sat opposite her, his gaze fixed on the city sprawling below, a panorama of shimmering lights and indifferent shadows. "I keep replaying it," she whispered, her voice barely above the hum of the city. "The trial, Thorne's face, everything." Julian turned, his eyes, usually sparkling with life, now held a deep well of weariness. He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers before gently settling on top. "It's over," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that held both comfort and a hint of underlying tremor. "The truth is out. But the lies, they still linger," Serafina countered, her voice tight with unshed tears. The public's perception, the whispers, the relentless media, they felt like a suffocating weight. She felt the sting of betrayal, not just from Thorne, but from the world that had so readily believed the lies. The city lights below, once symbols of their shared success, now seemed to mock her. "We'll face it together," Julian vowed, his hand squeezing hers with unexpected strength. We'll rebuild. It won't be easy, but we will. We have each other. His words, though simple, were a lifeline in the storm of doubt and uncertainty. A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. The rain outside intensified, a rhythmic drumming against the glass that mirrored the erratic beat of Serafina's heart.